The iron shackles had worn grooves into Virginia Anderson's wrists, each link a testament to the 3 months she had spent chained in the basement of what was once St. Matthew's Church. The stone walls wept with moisture, and the single candle that Father William Cooper allowed her flickered against the darkness, casting shadows that danced like demons across the crumbling mortar. She could hear the congregation above, their voices raised in Sunday hymns, while she sat forgotten in the bowels of what they called God's house. The basement reeked of mildew and something far worse, something that spoke of other souls who had been brought down here before her, souls who perhaps had never left. Virginia pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her thin cotton dress offering no protection against the chill that seemed to seep from the very earth itself. Her dark hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her once bright green eyes had dulled to the color of winter grass. Above her head, the floorboards creaked under the weight of the faithful, and she could make out the booming voice of Father Cooper as he delivered his sermon about sin and redemption. The irony was not lost on her. She had committed no sin other than refusing to marry Frank Allen, the town's wealthiest merchant and the church's most generous benefactor. That refusal had branded her as willful, disobedient, and in need of spiritual correction. The heavy wooden door at the top of the stone steps groaned open, and Virginia's body tensed involuntarily. The familiar sound of Father Cooper's footsteps echoed down the narrow staircase, each step deliberate and measured. She had learned to read the rhythm of his approach, to gauge his mood by the weight of his boots against the wood. Today, his steps carried an urgency that made her stomach clench with dread. "What's on?" His voice carried the false warmth that she had come to despise. Quote one, she looked up at him, this man who claimed to speak for God while keeping a woman chained like an animal in his basement. Father Cooper was not an old man, perhaps 40 years of age, with graying hair at his temples and eyes the color of winter sky. He wore his clerical collar with the pride of a man who believed his position elevated him above moral reproach. Virginia replied, her voice hoarse from disuse. Quote 3. His expression darkened at her response. Even after 3 months of captivity, she had not learned to keep her thoughts to herself, had not learned the submission he sought to teach her. This failure on her part seemed to both frustrate and fascinate him in equal measure. Quote 4. Father Cooper said, descending the last few steps until he stood before her. Quote 5. Virginia's laugh was bitter and sharp in the confined space. Indiscretions? Is that what you call refusing to marry a man who beats his horses and treats his servants like property? A man who has buried 2 wives already under mysterious circumstances? The slap came swift and hard, snapping her head to the side and leaving her cheek burning. Father Cooper's breathing had quickened, and she could see the flush of anger rising in his neck above his collar. Quote 7. He said, his voice tight with controlled rage. Quote 8. The mention of her parents sent a familiar ache through Virginia's chest. Her father had indeed been a drunkard, though she remembered him as a gentle man who had tried to drown his sorrows after her mother's death in the childbirth. He had died when Virginia was 16, leaving her with nothing but the small cabin on the outskirts of town and the few coins he had managed to save. Quote 9, Virginia said, meeting Father Cooper's gaze with a defiance that 3 months of imprisonment had not managed to break. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you were watching from and hype this video in the comments. Father Cooper's face contorted with rage, and for a moment Virginia thought he might strike her again. Instead, he turned abruptly and climbed the stairs, his footsteps heavy with frustration. The door slammed shut behind him, and Virginia heard the familiar sound of the bolt sliding into place. She was alone again with the flickering candle and the weight of her chains. The metal had grown warm against her skin, a constant reminder of her captivity. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what freedom felt like, tried to recall the sensation of walking through the mountain meadows that surrounded their small town of Cedar Falls. The town sat nestled in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, isolated from the larger world by miles of wilderness and treacherous passes. It was a place where secrets could be kept and where those with power could act without fear of outside interference. The nearest sheriff was 3 days' ride away, and the territorial governor might as well have been on the moon for all the help he could provide. Virginia had grown up in this isolation, had known no other world than the one bounded by pine-covered slopes and rocky peaks. Her father had taught her to read and write, skills that were uncommon among the women of Cedar Falls, and perhaps that education had contributed to her current predicament. An educated woman was a dangerous woman in the eyes of men like Father Cooper and Frank Allen. The hours passed slowly in the basement, marked only by the gradual dimming of her candle. Virginia had learned to ration the light, to blow out the flame during the darkest hours and sit in complete blackness rather than face the terror of being left without any illumination at all. The darkness brought its own horrors, sounds that might have been rats or might have been something worse. Whispers that could have been wind through the stone or the voices of those who had died in this place. As night fell above ground, Virginia heard the familiar sounds of the town settling into sleep. Cedar Falls was not a large place, perhaps 300 souls in total, and by 9 o'clock most of the windows would be dark and most of the doors would be barred against the dangers of the wilderness. It was during these quiet hours that Virginia allowed herself to hope, to imagine that someone might come for her, might discover her imprisonment and set her free. The sound that woke her was different from the usual creaks and settling of the old church. Virginia's eyes snapped open in the darkness, her heart immediately racing as she strained to listen. There it was again, a soft scraping sound that seemed to come from somewhere above her head but not from the main floor of the church. She had blown out her candle hours ago to conserve the wax, and now she sat in complete blackness, every sense heightened by the absence of sight. The scraping continued, as methodical and purposeful, as if someone were working at something with great care and patience. Wow. Virginia's first thought was that Father Cooper had returned, perhaps with Frank Allen in tow, ready to force her into submission through means she did not want to contemplate. But the sound was wrong for that, too careful, too quiet. If the father had come with violence in mind, he would not bother with stealth. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Virginia could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She pressed herself against the stone wall, the chains around her wrists clinking softly with the movement. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the stillness, and she held her breath, waiting for whatever was coming next. A new sound reached her ears, the soft whisper of displaced earth or debris falling. It came from directly above her head, from what she had always assumed was solid ceiling. Now she realized that there might be another space above the basement, some crawl space or a storage area that she had never considered. More debris fell, pattering down like rain onto the stone floor around her. Virginia could smell fresh earth now, and something else, the clean scent of mountain airs that spoke of the world beyond these walls. Her heart began to race with a hope she had not dared to feel in months. The falling debris increased, and suddenly a shaft of moonlight pierced the darkness above her head. Virginia looked up to see a hole opening in what she had thought was the ceiling, revealing the night sky beyond. The hole grew larger as whoever was above continued their work, and soon she could see stars twinkling in the clear mountain air. A face appeared in the opening, silhouetted against the stars. Virginia could make out little more than a dark outline, but something about the figure's size and the breadth of his shoulders told her it was a man. He remained still for a long moment, as if surveying the basement below, and then his voice drifted down to her, barely above a whisper. The question was so simple, so direct, that Virginia found herself unable to answer for a moment. After 3 months of Father Cooper's twisted theology and Frank Allen's veiled threats, someone was asking about her well-being with what sounded like genuine concern. Quote 11. She managed to say, her voice cracking from disuse and emotion. The man above her moved, and she could hear him working at something. A rope dropped through the opening, followed by what appeared to be a canvas bag. The rope continued to descend until it reached the floor beside her, and she could see that tools had been tied to the end of it. Quote, the voice said from above. Quote, Virginia stretched as far as her chains would allow, her fingertips just barely touching the canvas. The metal shackles bit into her wrists as she strained against them, but she managed to drag the bag close enough to open it. Inside, she found not only lockpicks, but also a small piece of bread and what felt like dried meat wrapped in cloth. Duh, she whispered up toward the opening. Quote, Ufaya, came the reply. Quote, Virginia had never used lockpicks before, but desperation and 3 months of captivity had given her a keen appreciation for the mechanics of her imprisonment. She had studied the locks that held her chains, had tested them countless times in her boredom and frustration. Now, with trembling fingers, she inserted the thin metal tools into the first lock. The work was delicate and frustrating. The pick slipped in her sweaty palms, and the darkness made it nearly impossible to see what she was doing. But gradually she began to feel the internal mechanisms of the lock, began to understand how the tumblers moved and what pressure was needed to manipulate them. Above her, the mysterious rescuer remained silent and still, a dark guardian against the star-filled sky. Virginia found his presence oddly comforting, even though she knew nothing about him beyond his apparent willingness to help her. In a town where everyone had either participated in her imprisonment or chosen to ignore it, the appearance of this stranger felt like a miracle. The first lock clicked and opened with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet basement. Virginia felt the shackle fall away from her left wrist, and she had to bite back a sob of relief. The skin beneath was raw and bleeding, marked with the permanent scars of her captivity. But her hand was free. The second lock proved more difficult. Her right hand was her dominant hand, but it was also more severely injured from her struggles against the chains. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy as she worked the picks, and twice she dropped them entirely, forcing her to feel around on the stone floor in the darkness. Ghost 17, the voice from above said softly, quoting in. His words gave her the patience she needed to continue. Gradually, she felt the second lock begin to yield to her efforts. The tumblers moved reluctantly, protesting years of rust and neglect, but finally she heard the sweet sound of metal disengaging from metal. The shackle fell away from her right wrist, and Virginia Anderson was free for the first time in 3 months. She sat in the darkness for a moment, hardly daring to believe it, her hands exploring her wrists where the metal had been. The skin was torn and infected, but she was free. Quote 19, the voice asked from above. Virginia looked up at the opening, judging the distance and her own strength. 3 months of captivity had weakened her considerably. She had been fed only bread and water, and her muscles had atrophied from lack of use. But the alternative was to remain in this basement, to wait for Father Cooper's return and the inevitable consequences of her escape attempt. I can try, she said. The rope dropped down again, this time with knots tied at regular intervals to provide handholds. Virginia grasped it with both hands, testing her grip and her strength. Her palms were slick with sweat and blood from her injured wrists, but she managed to maintain her hold. The climb was agonizing. Every movement sent pain shooting through her weakened muscles, and more than once she nearly lost her grip on the rope. But the thought of freedom drove her upward, inch by painful inch, until finally she felt strong hands grasp her arms and pull her up through the opening. She found herself lying on the ground beside what appeared to be a small shed or outbuilding attached to the back of the church. The night air was cool against her skin, and she could smell pine trees and wood smoke from the town's chimneys. After 3 months in the basement, the simple pleasure of breathing fresh air was almost overwhelming. The man who had rescued her was crouched beside the opening, replacing what looked like a wooden cover over the hole. In the moonlight, Virginia could see that he was indeed large, with broad shoulders and long, dark hair that fell to his collar. His clothes were rough and practical, the clothing of someone who spent his time outdoors, and she could see the outline of a rifle slung across his back. "Tatume hoitem," he said quietly, not looking at her directly. "Kotayan." Virginia tried to stand but found that her legs would not support her weight. 3 months of sitting in chains had left her muscles weak and unsteady, and she collapsed back to the ground with a soft cry of frustration. Without a word, the man scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Virginia tensed at the unexpected contact, her body reacting instinctively to the proximity of a stranger. But there was nothing threatening in his manner, nothing that suggested he meant her harm. She asked as he carried her away from the church. Quote 24. He replied, quote 25. They moved through the shadows behind the buildings of Cedar Falls, avoiding the main streets where even at this late hour someone might be awake and watching. Virginia caught glimpses of familiar landmarks, the blacksmith shop where she had once brought her father's tools for repair, the general store where she had traded eggs for supplies, the saloon where her father had spent his last years drowning his sorrows. The town looked different in the darkness, smaller and more fragile than she remembered. From her basement prison, Cedar Falls had seemed like an impregnable fortress, a place where the powerful could act without consequence. Now she could see it for what it truly was, a tiny settlement clinging to existence in the vast wilderness of the mountains. They reached the edge of town, where the last buildings gave way to forest and meadow. Here the man set her down beside a horse that had been waiting patiently in the shadows. The animal was large and dark, with the sturdy build of a mountain horse bred for rough terrain and long distances. Quote 26, the man asked. Virginia nodded, though she was not entirely certain. She had ridden as a child, but that had been years ago, and her current weakness made everything uncertain. The man seemed to sense her doubt, because he lifted her onto the horse's back and then swung up behind her, taking the reins in his capable hands. They rode in silence through the darkness, following what seemed to be a well-known trail that wound up into the mountains. Virginia found herself leaning back against the man's chest, grateful for his warmth and stability as the horse carried them away from Cedar Falls. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, could smell the scent of wood smoke and leather that clung to his clothes. She asked finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Code 28. He replied after a moment's hesitation. The name meant nothing to Virginia, which was surprising in a town as small as Cedar Falls. She thought she knew everyone who lived in the valley, at least by reputation, if not by sight. Adam Baker was a stranger, which raised questions about how he had known of her imprisonment in Wildthorn and why he had chosen to help her. How did you know where to find me? She asked. Word travels in the mountains, Vaughn, Adam said simply. There are those who do not approve of what was being done to you. This answer raised more questions than it answered, but Virginia found that she did not have the energy to pursue them. The motion of the horse and the warmth of Adam's body behind her were making her drowsy, and for the first time in months she felt something approaching safety. They climbed higher into the mountains, following trails that seemed to exist more in Adam's memory than in any visible reality. The trees grew thicker around them, tall pines and firs that blocked out much of the moonlight and created a world of deep shadows and whispered sounds. Virginia could hear the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the soft sound of water running over stones. After what felt like hours of riding, they emerged into a clearing where a small cabin sat nestled among the trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, suggesting that someone had been expecting their arrival. Adam dismounted first and then helped Virginia down from the horse, his hands gentle but impersonal as he supported her weight. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from the outside, with a main room that served as both kitchen and living area, and what appeared to be a separate bedroom beyond a partially open door. The furnishings were simple but well made, the work of someone who understood both function and craftsmanship. A fire burned in the stone fireplace, and the smell of cooking food made Virginia's stomach clench with hunger. "Potato," Adam said, guiding her to a chair beside the fire. Quoth, he moved around the cabin with the easy familiarity of someone in his own space, ladling what smelled like stew from a pot that had been simmering over the fire. The bowl he placed before her was filled with meat and vegetables, more food than she had seen in the past 3 months combined. Virginia ate slowly at first, her stomach unused to solid food after months of bread and water. But gradually her appetite returned, and she found herself eating with an eagerness that might have been embarrassing under different circumstances. Adam watched her eat without comment, his own meal forgotten as he studied her face in the firelight. He said finally, Virginia asked between bites. "Quote 37, Adam Eisflau, about 38. The reminder of her recent captivity sent a shiver through Virginia, despite the warmth of the fire. She looked down at her wrists, at the raw wounds left by the shackles, and wondered if she would ever truly feel free again. She asked, "Quote 40. Adam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames might provide him with an answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft and distant. "Quote what?" he said. "Quote v2." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, a pain that went deeper than simple sympathy for her plight. Virginia wanted to ask him more, to understand what had brought him to this isolated cabin and what had motivated him to risk his own safety for hers. But exhaustion was beginning to overwhelm her, and she found it difficult to keep her eyes open. Quote 43, Adam said, noticing her struggle. Quote formally, Virginia wanted to protest, to insist that she could not take his bed while he sat up all night. but her body was betraying her, demanding the rest that had been so long denied. Adam helped her to the bedroom, where a comfortable bed waited with clean sheets and warm blankets. Code 45, she whispered as he turned to leave. Code Banda, he replied. Code 47, Virginia woke to the sound of birds singing outside the cabin window and the smell of coffee brewing in the main room. For a moment she was disoriented, unable to remember where she was or how she had come to be in this comfortable bed. Then memory flooded back, bringing with it a mixture of relief and uncertainty about what the future might hold. Sunlight streamed through the window, revealing that the cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and aspens, whose leaves were just beginning to turn with the approach of autumn. She could see mountains rising in the distance, their peaks touched with early snow that gleamed white against the blue sky. Virginia sat up carefully, testing her strength and finding it somewhat improved after a night of real sleep. Her wrists were still painful and swollen where the shackles had rubbed them raw, but the wounds had stopped bleeding and showed signs of beginning to heal. She found her rescuer, Adam Baker, sitting at a rough wooden table in the main room, a cup of coffee steaming before him as he cleaned what appeared to be a hunting rifle. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes taking in her appearance with what seemed like professional assessment. He asked, Virginia replied, and found that it was true. Quote 50. Adam nodded and gestured toward the stove, where a pot of coffee waited alongside what looked like biscuits and honey. Quote 51, he said simply. Quote 55. As Virginia prepared her breakfast, she found herself studying her rescuer more closely in the daylight. Adam Baker was a man of perhaps 30 years, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in town, tied back with a leather cord, and his clothes were practical rather than stylish. But there was something in his bearing, in the way he moved and spoke, that suggested education and refinement beneath the rough exterior. Quote 53, Virginia said as she sat down across from him with her coffee. Quote 54, Adam agreed. Quote 55, quote Anjas, Adam's hands stilled on the rifle he was cleaning, and Virginia saw something flicker in his eyes, some emotion that was quickly suppressed. I help people who need helping, he said finally. People who have nowhere else to turn. The answer was deliberately vague, but Virginia sensed that pressing for more details would not be welcome. Instead, she sipped her coffee and tried to organize her thoughts about her current situation. She was free from her captivity, but she was also homeless and penniless, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew. They will be looking for me, she said. Yes, Adam agreed. Father Cooper will have discovered your escape by now. He will be organizing search parties, offering rewards for information about your whereabouts. The thought of Father Cooper's rage when he found the empty basement sent a chill through Virginia. The man had invested considerable effort in trying to break her will, and her escape would be seen as a personal affront to his authority. Quote, she asked. Quote, Adam said with quiet certainty. Quote, Virginia looked around the cabin again, noting details she had missed in her exhaustion the night before. The construction was solid and well-planned, but there were no personal touches, no photographs or mementos that might give insight into Adam's history or background. It was the home of a man who was prepared to leave at a moment's notice, who kept no ties to bind him to any particular place. Quote 65, she asked. Adam set down his rifle and looked at her directly for the first time since she had awakened. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and there was a depth to them that spoke of experiences both painful and profound. Quote, show out, he said. Quote 67. The word freedom hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. Virginia had spent 3 months dreaming of escape, but she had given little thought to what would come after. She had no money, no family, no skills that would allow her to support herself in the wider world beyond Cedar Falls. She admitted. Quote, 69. Quote, Adam said. Quote, Charmjo. They spent the morning in comfortable silence, Virginia resting and eating while Adam went about various tasks around the cabin. She watched him through the window as he tended to his horse, chopped wood for the fire, and checked what appeared to be snares set around the perimeter of the clearing. His movements were economical and purposeful, those of a man accustomed to solitude and self-sufficiency. In the afternoon, Adam announced that he needed to go into town to gather information about the search for Virginia. She felt a moment of panic at the thought of being left alone, but he assured her that the cabin was well hidden and that he would return before nightfall. Code 72, he instructed. Code 73. After Adam left, Virginia found herself truly alone for the first time since her escape. The silence of the mountains was different from the oppressive quiet of the church basement, filled with the sounds of wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds and animals. She explored the cabin more thoroughly, finding evidence of a man who lived simply but comfortably, who had the skills necessary to survive in the wilderness. In a wooden chest, she found books, more books than she would have expected in such a remote location. The titles suggested a man of broad interest and considerable education, volumes of poetry, philosophy, history, and natural science. Many of the books showed signs of frequent reading, their pages worn soft from handling. The discovery of the books raised new questions about Adam Baker's background and motivations. This was not the library of a simple mountain man or drifter. These were the possessions of someone who had once moved in educated circles, someone who had chosen isolation rather than had it forced upon him. As the afternoon wore on, Virginia found herself growing increasingly anxious about Adam's return. She knew that his absence was necessary, that they needed information about the search efforts, but she could not shake the fear that something might happen to him. The thought of being abandoned again, of finding herself alone and defenseless in the wilderness, was almost paralyzing. When she finally heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the cabin, Virginia felt a relief so profound that it surprised her. She had known Adam Baker for less than 24 hours, but already she had come to depend on his presence, his quiet strength and competence. Adam's expression was grim as he dismounted and approached the cabin. Virginia could see in his face that the news he carried was not good, and she braced herself for whatever he had learned in town. "They are offering a reward," he said without preamble. $100 for information leading to your return. Father Cooper claims you were taken by force, that you are being held against your will by dangerous men. The irony of Father Cooper's claim was not lost on Virginia. The man who had kept her chained in a basement was now portraying himself as her protector, concerned for her welfare and safety. She asked, quote 77. Adam replied, quote 78, quote 70. Adam's expression darkened further. Frank Allen Buftin is leading the search parties personally. He has sworn to bring you back, to see that justice is done to those who took you. The thought of Frank Allen organizing armed men to hunt for her sent a chill through Virginia. She had seen the man's capacity for violence in the way he treated his animals and servants. She could only imagine what he might do if he found her, what punishment he might devise for her defiance. She asked. Adam admitted. Virginia felt the walls of her newfound freedom closing in around her. She had escaped one prison only to find herself trapped in another, this one bounded by mountains and the threat of pursuit rather than by stone walls and iron chains. She asked. Adam was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains that surrounded them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision that suggested he had been considering their options throughout his time in town. Quote 85, he said simply. Quote Paxton. The prospect of venturing even deeper into the wilderness was daunting, but Virginia knew that Adam was right. They could not remain in the cabin indefinitely, could not hope that their hiding place would remain undiscovered forever. She asked, Adam replied. Virginia looked around the cabin that had been her sanctuary for barely 24 hours, already feeling a sense of loss at the thought of leaving it behind. But she knew that attachment to any place was a luxury she could not afford, not while Frank Allen and Father Cooper were hunting for her. As darkness fell over the mountains, Adam began preparing for their departure. He moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, gathering supplies and equipment with the ease of someone who had done this many times before. Virginia watched him work, noting how he selected only the most essential items, leaving behind anything that might slow their progress or prove unnecessary for survival in the wilderness. He advised as he handed her a canvas bag. Good 91. Virginia had little to pack beyond the clothes she wore and a few items Adam had provided for her comfort. The realization that her entire worldly possessions could fit in a small bag was both liberating and terrifying. She had been stripped of everything that had once defined her existence, reduced to the most basic elements of survival. Adam loaded his rifle and checked his ammunition. his movements calm and methodical despite the urgency of their situation. Virginia found his composure reassuring, evidence that he had faced similar dangers before and survived them. She asked. Adam paused in his preparations, his hands stilling on the leather holster he was adjusting. He said simply, the admission raised new questions about Adam's background and the nature of his work, but Virginia sensed that this was not the time for detailed explanations. They had more pressing concerns than satisfying her curiosity about her rescuer's past. They left the cabin in the deep darkness before dawn, when the night was at its blackest and the chances of being observed were minimal. Adam led his horse rather than riding, explaining that they needed to move silently through the forest and that the sound of hoofbeats might carry to unwanted ears. The trail they followed was barely visible even in daylight, little more than a game path that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen. Adam moved with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, never hesitating at the numerous forks and branches that would have left Virginia hopelessly lost within minutes. They climbed steadily up over there, leaving the valley floor behind as they ascended toward the high country. The air grew thinner and colder with each step, and Virginia found herself breathing heavily from the exertion. Her 3 months of captivity had weakened her more than she had realized, and she struggled to match Adam's steady pace. Rest, Adam said when he noticed her difficulty, though they had been walking for less than an hour. I can continue, Virginia protested, not wanting to be seen as a burden. Rest, Adam repeated firmly. We have a long way to go, and there is no point in exhausting yourself in the first mile. They stopped beside a small stream that tumbled down from the peaks above, its water clear and cold as winter ice. Virginia knelt beside the stream and splashed water on her face, the shock of the cold helping to clear her head and restore some of her energy. Where exactly are we going? Shawn asked as they resumed their journey. There is a valley about 20 miles from here, Adam replied, hidden behind a pass that most people would never think to explore. There are caves there, natural shelters that will provide protection from the weather and concealment from any search parties. 20 miles seemed like an impossible distance to Virginia in her weakened condition, but she knew that complaining would accomplish nothing. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on matching Adam's steady rhythm as they climbed higher into the mountains. The hours passed in a blur of exertion and determination. Virginia's legs ached, her lungs burned from the thin air, and her feet had begun to blister in boots that were not designed for long-distance hiking. But gradually she found a rhythm that she could sustain, a pace that pushed her limits without breaking her entirely. As dawn approached, they reached a high meadow where Adam called for a longer rest. The view from their vantage point was spectacular, with the valley of Cedar Falls spread out far below them and mountain peaks stretching to the horizon in every direction. Virginia could see the tiny buildings of the town, looking impossibly small and insignificant from this height. They will be starting their search soon, Adam observed, studying the town through a small spyglass he had produced from his pack. Virginia followed his gaze and thought she could see movement in the streets below, though at this distance it was impossible to make out details. The knowledge that men were already beginning to hunt for her sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Do you think they will find the cabin? She asked. Eventually, Adam replied honestly. Frank Allen has the money to hire good trackers, and there are men in these mountains who know the country almost as well as I do. But by the time they discover it, we will be long gone. They resumed their journey as the sun rose higher, following trails that grew increasingly faint and treacherous. Adam's horse picked its way carefully over loose rock and fallen timber, while Virginia struggled to maintain her footing on terrain that seemed designed to challenge every step. By midday, they had reached country that was truly wild, far from any human habitation or influence. The trees here were ancient giants that had never known the bite of an axe, and the silence was broken only by the wind in the branches and the distant cry of eagles circling high above. Quote 107. Adam said during one of their brief rests, quote 100. Virginia looked around at the wilderness that surrounded them, feeling both awed and intimidated by its vastness and power. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of these mountain bands, but she had never truly understood their scale and majesty until now. Quote 109, she asked. Quote 110. Adam was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the peaks that rose around them. He said finally, The pain in his voice suggested experiences that Virginia could only imagine, a past filled with the kind of trauma that drove a man to seek solitude in the wilderness. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what had shaped him into the man who had risked everything to help her. But she sensed that such questions would not be welcome. As the afternoon wore on, they began to descend into a narrow canyon that cut deep into the heart of the mountains. The walls rose steeply on either side, creating a sense of enclosure that was both protective and claustrophobic. A stream ran along the canyon floor, its voice echoing off the stone walls in a constant murmur of sound. Adam explained as they followed the stream deeper into the canyon. Quote 114. The mention of sacred ground made Virginia uneasy. She had heard stories of Indian territories, of places where white settlers were not welcome, and where trespassers faced consequences that were both swift and severe. Quote 115, she asked. Quote 116, Adam replied. Quote 117, his words suggested a relationship with the local Indian population that went deeper than casual acquaintance. Another piece of the puzzle that was Adam Baker's mysterious past. Virginia found herself wondering what kind of man could move freely between the white and Indian worlds. What experiences had earned him such acceptance? The canyon began to open up as they progressed deeper into its heart, revealing glimpses of a hidden valley beyond. The walls grew lower and the stream widened, creating small pools and meadows that spoke of a gentler landscape ahead. And then, as they rounded a final bend in the canyon, Virginia saw their destination spread out before them. The hidden valley stretched before them like something from a dream, a sanctuary carved from the living rock by forces older than memory. Towering walls of red stone rose on all sides, their surfaces painted with streaks of mineral deposits that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in shades of gold and copper. Ancient pines clung to impossible ledges, their roots finding purchase in cracks no wider than a man's hand. While below them, a crystal stream meandered through meadows of wild grass that had never known the bite of plow or scythe. Virginia stood at the canyon's mouth, her breath caught in her throat as she took in the impossible beauty of the place. After the harsh reality of her captivity and the grueling climb through the mountains, the valley seemed like a vision conjured from her deepest longings for peace and safety. The air itself felt different here, cleaner somehow, as if the very walls that protected this place also purified everything within their embrace. "This is where we will wait," Adam said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the profound silence that filled the valley. "Here, among the old spirits, where even Frank Allen's money cannot reach." He led his horse down a gentle slope toward the valley floor, following what appeared to be an ancient trail worn smooth by countless generations of feet. Virginia followed, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she marveled at the hidden world that Adam had brought her to. Everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of careful tending, of a place that had been loved and protected for longer than she could imagine. Near the center of the valley, where the stream formed a natural pool, fed by a small waterfall, Adam stopped beside what appeared to be a collection of natural caves carved into the base of the cliff. The openings were partially concealed by hanging vines and carefully arranged stones, invisible to casual observation, but clearly prepared for habitation by someone who understood the art of concealment. "These caves have sheltered my people for many generations," a voice said from the shadows near the largest opening. Virginia spun toward the sound, her heart racing as a figure emerged from what she had thought was empty stone. The woman who stepped into the light was unlike anyone Virginia had ever seen, her skin the color of burnished copper and her long black hair braided with feathers and small bones that clicked softly as she moved. She wore clothing made from animal hides decorated with intricate beadwork, and her dark eyes held a depth of knowledge that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship and loss. "Virginia Anderson," Madam said formally. "This is Donna Nelson, keeper of the sacred places and guardian of the old ways." The introduction seemed to carry weight beyond its simple words, as if Adam were presenting Virginia not just to another person but to the valley itself and all it represented. Donna studied Virginia with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if every secret and weakness were being cataloged and weighed. "She is the one you spoke of," Donna said finally, her English accented but clear. "The woman who would not break under their chains." Virginia felt a flush of surprise and something that might have been pride at the description. She had not thought of her refusal to submit to Frank Allen and Father Cooper as strength, had seen it more as stubborn foolishness that had brought her nothing but pain. But there was something in Donna's tone that suggested a different interpretation of her ordeal. Quote 25, Donna continued, addressing Adam. Quote 26, she gestured toward the caves, and Virginia could see that they had been prepared for guests. Blankets and furs were arranged near a carefully banked fire, and the smell of cooking food drifted from clay pots arranged around the coals. It was clear that their arrival had been expected, that preparations had been made for their comfort and safety. Virginia asked, finding her voice at last. Donna smiled, the expression transforming her stern features into something almost maternal. The explanation seemed impossible to Virginia's rational mind, but she had seen too much in the past day to dismiss anything as beyond the realm of possibility. If Adam Baker could appear in the darkness to free her from her chains, if a hidden valley could exist unknown to the outside world, then perhaps the mountains themselves could carry messages to those who understood their language. You are safe here, Donna continued, leading them toward the prepared cave. The men who hunt you will not find this place, and if they did, they would not dare to enter it. This valley is protected by powers older than their greed and stronger than their hatred. As they settled into the cave that would be their home for an unknown period, Virginia found herself studying the relationship between Adam and Donna. There was a familiarity between them that spoke of long association, a comfort that suggested trust built over years rather than months. Adam moved through the space with the ease of someone who had been here many times before, and Donna treated him not as a guest, but as family returning home. You have been here before, Virginia observed as Adam arranged their few possessions in the cave. Many times, he admitted. This valley has been my refuge when the world outside became too dangerous or too painful to bear. The admission raised new questions about Adam's past, about the circumstances that had driven him to seek sanctuary in this hidden place. Virginia wanted to ask more, to understand the man who had risked everything to help her. But she sensed that such revelations would come in their own time, if they came at all. As evening fell over the valley, they gathered around the fire with Donna and several other members of her tribe who had appeared as silently as shadows from the surrounding caves. The group was small, perhaps a dozen people in total, ranging from ancient elders whose faces were maps of wisdom and suffering, to children whose dark eyes sparkled with curiosity about the pale-skinned woman who had come to their sanctuary. The meal they shared was simple but nourishing, consisting of venison stew flavored with wild herbs and roots that Virginia could not identify. The food was accompanied by a bread made from ground acorns and pine nuts, its texture unfamiliar, but its taste surprisingly satisfying. As they ate, the tribe members spoke quietly among themselves in their native language, their voices creating a gentle murmur that seemed to blend with the sound of the stream and the whisper of wind through the pines. 4. Donna said to Virginia as the meal concluded and the others began to drift away to their own caves and concerns. Virginia found herself recounting her story from her father's death through her refusal to marry Frank Allen to her imprisonment in the church basement. As she spoke, she watched Donna's face for signs of judgment or disbelief, but found only patient attention in what might have been growing anger on her behalf. Quote 135. Donna said when Virginia had finished, quote working, quote Jean, Virginia replied simply, quote Weirdyton, quote Worthington. Donna nodded slowly as if Virginia's answers confirmed something she had already suspected. Then you understand what it means to be truly free, even if you have never experienced such freedom. That understanding is the first step toward claiming it. The conversation continued deep into the night, ranging from practical matters of survival in the valley to philosophical discussions about the nature of freedom and the obligations that came with it. Virginia found herself drawn into a way of thinking that was entirely foreign to her upbringing, a worldview that valued individual choice and personal autonomy over social convention and masculine authority. In my people's way, Donna explained, a woman chooses her own path, makes her own decisions about whom she will marry and how she will live. No man, no matter how powerful or wealthy, can force her into a union she does not desire. The concept seemed almost revolutionary to Virginia, who had been raised to believe that a woman's highest calling was obedience to male authority, first to her father and then to her husband. The idea that she might have the right to determine her own fate, to choose her own future without regard for what others might think appropriate, was both thrilling and terrifying. The days that followed settled into a rhythm unlike anything Virginia had ever experienced. She woke each morning to the sound of birds singing in the ancient pines and the gentle murmur of the stream as it made its way through the valley. The air was clean and sweet, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant snow that crowned the surrounding peaks. Under Donna's patient guidance, Virginia began to learn the skills necessary for survival in this hidden world. She gathered edible plants and roots, learned to identify the berries and nuts that could sustain life during the harsh mountain winters, and discovered how to prepare medicines from the herbs that grew wild in the valley's protected meadows. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that her previous life had never been. Each skill she mastered, each small task she completed successfully, added to a growing sense of competence and self-reliance that she had never known she possessed. For the first time in her life, Virginia began to understand what it might mean to be truly independent, to rely on her own abilities rather than the protection and provision of others. Adam spent his days ranging through the surrounding mountains, keeping watch for signs of pursuit and gathering information about the search efforts that continued in the valleys below. He would disappear before dawn and return as the sun was setting, his face grim with whatever news he had gathered during his solitary journeys. He reported one evening as they gathered around the fire for their communal meal. "Gut 100 warned." The news sent a chill through Virginia, though she tried not to show her fear. She had begun to feel safe in the hidden valley, protected by its walls and the ancient spirits that Donna claimed watched over it. The reminder that dangerous men were actively hunting for deer brought back all the anxiety and dread that had marked her first days of freedom. "Quote one form," Donna asked, her voice calm but alert. "Quote 46. Adam replied. Quote 47. Virginia's heart sank at the thought of the sanctuary that had given her her first taste of freedom being violated by Frank Allen's hired men. She could imagine them pawing through Adam's possessions, destroying the careful order he had created in his wilderness home. "Will they be able to track us here?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Adam was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as he considered the question. "The trail we followed was difficult to read, even in good conditions," he said finally. "Rain has fallen since we passed through, and the wind has scattered our tracks. But these are skilled men, and they are being paid well for their efforts. We cannot assume that we are completely safe." The conversation turned to practical matters of defense and escape routes should the valley's location be discovered. Virginia listened with growing unease as Adam and Donna discussed the various ways their sanctuary might be approached and the limited options for flight if retreat became necessary. Quote 151, Donna explained, gesturing toward the eastern wall of the valley. Quote 152, quote 153, Adam asked. Quote 154. Donna replied, quote 155. The implications of this information were clear to Virginia. If they were forced to flee deeper into the mountains, they would be trapped there for months, dependent entirely on their own resources and skills for survival. It was a daunting prospect, but perhaps no more daunting than the alternative of being captured and returned to Frank Allen's tender mercies. As the days passed, Virginia found herself growing stronger, both physically and mentally. The good food and clean air had restored much of the health she had lost during her months of captivity, while the daily challenges of life in the valley had built her confidence and self-reliance. She began to feel like a different person from the broken woman who had been chained in the church basement, someone capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. Her relationship with Adam also began to deepen during this period, though neither of them spoke directly about the growing connection between them. They worked together in comfortable silence, sharing tasks and responsibilities with an ease that spoke of natural compatibility. Virginia found herself watching him when she thought he was not aware, studying the way he moved through the world with such quiet competence and grace. There were moments when she caught him watching her as well, his dark eyes holding an expression that made her heart race and her cheeks flush with warmth. But he maintained a careful distance between them, never presuming upon their forced intimacy or taking advantage of her vulnerable position. His respect for her autonomy and dignity was absolute, even when she sometimes wished he might be less restrained in his attentions. He is a good man, Donna observed one afternoon as they gathered medicinal herbs in a sunny meadow near the center of the valley. Virginia looked up from the plants she was examining, startled by the directness of the comment. Yes, she agreed simply. But a man with much pain in his past, Donna continued, pain that makes him careful about opening his heart to others. What happened to him? Virginia asked, then immediately regretted the question. I am sorry, I should not pry into his private affairs. Donna smiled at her concern. It is natural to want to understand those we care about. But Adam's story is his own to tell, when and if he chooses to share it. I will say only that he has known loss, has paid a heavy price for standing against those who would use their power to harm the innocent. The cryptic response only deepened Virginia's curiosity about Adam's background, but she respected Donna's discretion and did not press for more details. Instead, she focused on learning the properties of the various plants they were gathering, absorbing knowledge that might prove crucial for survival in the wilderness. That evening, as they sat around the fire sharing the day's final meal, one of the young men who served as scouts for the tribe came running into the circle of light cast by the flames. His face was flushed with exertion and fear, and he spoke rapidly in his native language to Donna, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. Virginia watched Donna's face grow grave as she listened to the scout's report, and her heart began to race even before the translation came. They have found the entrance to the canyon, Donna said quietly. A large party of armed men, led by the one called Frank Allen. They are making camp at the mouth of the passage, preparing to explore it in the morning. The news hit Virginia like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her dizzy with fear. After weeks of relative safety in the hidden valley, the reality of her situation came crashing back with devastating force. Frank Allen had found her refuge, had tracked her to the very edge of her sanctuary. Adam was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies with the practiced efficiency of a man who had faced such crises before. How many men? He asked the scout. The young man held up both hands twice, indicating 20 or more armed searchers. The odds were overwhelming, even with the advantage of familiar terrain and defensive positions. We need to leave, Adam said to Virginia, his voice calm but urgent, now while we still have the cover of darkness. Where will we go? Virginia asked, though she already knew the answer. The high passes, Donna replied, into the sacred mountains where the old spirits hold sway and where few mortals dare to venture. As the tribe began their preparations for flight, Virginia felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a crushing burden. These people were being forced to abandon their sanctuary because of her, were risking their lives in their connection to this sacred place because they had chosen to help her. The guilt was almost overwhelming, but she knew that self-recrimination would serve no useful purpose now. I am sorry, she said to Donna as they quickly packed the most essential supplies. This is my fault. If I had not come here, you would not be forced to flee your home. Donna paused in her work and looked directly into Virginia's eyes. She said firmly, quote, The distinction was important, Virginia realized, though it did little to ease her guilt about the consequences of her presence. She focused on the practical tasks at hand, helping to gather food and medicine, and clothing for what might be a very long journey into the unknown. Within an hour, the small tribe was ready to abandon the valley that had been their home for generations. They moved like shadows in the darkness, each person carrying only what was absolutely essential for survival in the harsh mountain environment they were about to enter. The children were silent and wide-eyed, understanding without being told that their very lives might depend on their ability to move quietly through the night. Adam led the way toward the eastern wall of the valley, following a path that was invisible to Virginia's untrained eyes, but clearly familiar to him and the tribal members. The road climbed steeply from the valley floor, winding between massive boulders and through stands of ancient trees that seemed to lean in protectively over the fleeing group. Virginia struggled to keep pace with the others, her recent recovery from months of captivity leaving her less prepared for such strenuous exertion than she would have liked. But determination and fear drove her forward, step by painful step, as they climbed toward the high passes that would either save them or become their tomb. Behind them, she could occasionally glimpse the flicker of campfires at the canyon's entrance, where Frank Allen and his hired men waited for dawn to begin their assault on the hidden valley. The sight of those distant flames filled her with a mixture of terror and rage, emotions that warred within her as she forced her aching legs to continue their upward climb. Quote one, she asked Adam during one of their brief rests. What, he replied grimly. Quote, the thought of being hunted through the high country by armed men was terrifying, but Virginia found that her fear was tempered by a growing sense of defiance. She had survived 3 months of captivity, had escaped from chains that were meant to break her spirit, and had learned to live free in the wilderness. She would not be taken easily, would not submit to Frank Allen's will without a fight that would cost him dearly. As the night wore on and they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder. Virginia could see her breath misting in the starlight, and she pulled her borrowed coat more tightly around her shoulders. The trail they followed became increasingly treacherous, winding along narrow ledges and across loose scree that shifted dangerously underfoot. Stay close to the rock face, Adam instructed as they negotiated a particularly narrow section of the path. Do not look down, and do not let fear make you careless. One mistake here could be fatal. Virginia pressed herself against the cold stone wall, feeling her way carefully along the ledge. Loose rocks skittered away beneath her feet and disappeared into the darkness below. The sound of their fall seemed to echo forever before finally fading into silence, a reminder of just how high they had climbed and how far they had to fall if they made a single wrong step. By dawn, they had reached a high plateau where the tribe called another halt to rest and assess their situation. From this vantage point, they could see back down into the valley they had abandoned, could watch as tiny figures moved through the meadows and around the caves that had been their sanctuary. Adam studied the distant activity through his spyglass, his expression growing increasingly grim as he observed the searchers below. They are thorough, he reported. They have found evidence of our presence and are examining everything carefully. It will not take them long to discover our escape route. Even as he spoke, Virginia could see movement at the base of the eastern wall, figures that appeared to be examining the ground for tracks and other signs of their passage. The hunters were skilled and determined, qualities that would serve them well in the pursuit that was sure to follow. How much of a lead do we have? Donna asked. Perhaps 6 hours, Adam replied. Maybe less if they push hard and do not stop to rest. 6 hours seemed like no time at all when measured against the vast distances they would need to cover to reach true safety. Virginia looked around at the elderly members of the tribe, at the children who were already showing signs of exhaustion from the night's climb, and wondered how they could possibly maintain the pace necessary to stay ahead of their pursuers. Quote 185. Donna said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that suggested she was considering options that were both dangerous and distasteful. Quote 126, Adam asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected what she might be thinking. Quote 187, Donna replied. Quote 180, Adam was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of what Donna was suggesting. Quote 189, he said finally. Quote 190, quote 191. Donna agreed that quote 192. The debate that followed was conducted in hushed tones, with various members of the tribe offering their opinions about the wisdom of attempting to use the ancient pathways. Virginia listened without fully understanding the technical details being discussed, but she could sense the capacity of the decision they faced. She asked Adam when there was a pause in the conversation. He replied, quote 25. The description was hardly reassuring, but Virginia understood that they had few alternatives. They could continue on the known trails and risk being overtaken by their pursuers, or they could venture into the unknown and face whatever dangers the ancient paths might hold. Quote, she said simply. Quote 27. Her words seemed to settle something for Adam, and he turned back to Donna with a nod of agreement. Quote 1, he said. Quote Mayan. Donna led them away from the plateau toward what appeared to be an unbroken wall of stone rising into the clouds above. As they drew closer, Virginia could see that the rock face was actually broken by a narrow cleft, a crack in the mountain that was barely wide enough for a single person to pass through. The opening was so well concealed that she would never have noticed it without Donna's guidance. This is the beginning of the first trail, Donna explained as they gathered at the entrance to the cleft. Beyond this point, we enter the domain of the old spirits. We must show proper respect and ask permission for our passage. What followed was a brief ceremony conducted entirely in the tribal language, with Donna and the other members of her people offering prayers and small gifts to the unseen powers that supposedly govern this place. Virginia found herself moved by the solemnity of the ritual, even though she did not understand its specific meaning or significance. When the ceremony was complete, they entered the cleft single file, with Donna leading the way and Adam bringing up the rear. The passage was narrow and dark, with walls that pressed in so closely that Virginia could touch both sides with her outstretched arms. The floor was uneven and treacherous, requiring careful attention to every step. After what felt like hours of slow progress through the claustrophobic passage, they emerged into a hidden canyon that took Virginia's breath away. The walls rose impossibly high on all sides, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that appeared to be both natural and artificial. Waterfalls cascaded down from invisible sources high above, creating pools of crystal clear water that reflected the narrow strip of sky visible overhead. Quote 202, Donna said softly. Quote 203. Virginia could feel the truth of those words in the very air around them. There was something different about this place, something that made her skin tingle and her heart race with a mixture of awe and fear. The canyon felt alive in a way that defied rational explanation, as if the stones themselves were watching and judging their passage. They made their way carefully across the canyon floor, following a path that seemed to have been worn into the rock by countless generations of feet. Along the way, they passed structures that were clearly artificial but so ancient that they seemed to have grown from the stone itself. These ruins were covered with symbols and carvings that spoke of a civilization far older than anything Virginia had ever imagined. As they progressed deeper into the sacred canyon, Virginia became aware of sounds that seemed to come from the very walls around them. Whispers in languages she did not recognize, echoes of footsteps that belonged to no member of their party, the distant sound of drums that beat in rhythm with her own pulse. The effect was both mesmerizing and terrifying, as if the canyon itself were alive and aware of their presence. Donna warned as they paused beside one of the ancient pools. Quote 5. Virginia nodded, though she found it difficult to ignore the compelling whispers that seemed to call her name from the shadows between the carved stones. There was something seductive about the voices, something that promised answers to questions she had never thought to ask. The path through the canyon was longer and more complex than she had expected, winding back and forth across the narrow floor and occasionally climbing up carved steps to higher levels. At each turn, new wonders revealed themselves. Chambers filled with crystalline formations that sang in the wind, pools of water that glowed with their own inner upward light, gardens of flowers that bloomed in impossible colors despite the absence of direct sunlight. Kotusarusketa Virginia asked Adam as they passed through a grove of trees whose leaves seemed to be made of silver and gold. Quote 207, he admitted. Quote 208. His words reminded Virginia that Adam had traveled these paths before, that he was familiar with the sacred places and the dangers they contained. The knowledge raised new questions about his background and the circumstances that had brought him to this hidden world. But she sensed that this was not the time for such inquiries. They had been traveling through the canyon for several hours when Donna called a halt beside a particularly elaborate set of ruins. The structures here were more intact than those they had passed earlier, with walls and doorways that suggested they had once been inhabited by beings of considerable sophistication. Quote 209, Donna announced. Quote 210. The ruins provided shelter from the wind that had begun to blow through the canyon, and the tribe members quickly set about preparing a simple meal from their limited supplies. Virginia found herself drawn to the carved walls that surrounded their resting place, studying the intricate symbols and figures that covered every available surface. The artwork was unlike anything she had ever seen, depicting scenes that seemed to show the history of the world from its creation to its eventual transformation into something entirely new. There were images of great floods and fires, of mountains rising from the sea and stars falling from the sky, of beings that were neither fully human nor entirely animal. Book 211. She asked Donna, who had come to stand beside her as she examined the carvings. Book 212, Donna replied. Quote 2 from, quote 2 from, Quote, Donna said simply. Quote, Sings. The concept was difficult for Virginia to grasp, trained as she was in linear thinking and Christian theology. But there was something about the carvings that seemed to speak directly to her soul, that suggested truths beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. As they rested in the ancient ruins, Adam kept watch for signs of pursuit from the world they had left behind. He positioned himself at the entrance to the canyon, using his spyglass to scan the approaches for any indication that Frank Allen's men had discovered their trail. Anything? Virginia asked when she brought him food and water. Not yet, he replied, though his expression remained troubled. But they will come. Frank Allen is not the kind of man to give up easily, and he has too much invested in this hunt to turn back now. What will happen if they find us here? Adam was quiet for a moment, considering the question and its implications. These canyons are sacred to Donna's people, he said finally. They are protected by powers that do not look kindly on those who would bring violence to this place. But I do not know if those protections extend to outsiders like Frank Allen and his men. The uncertainty in his voice was troubling, but Virginia found that she was less afraid than she might have expected. The peace of the sacred canyon had settled into her bones, giving her a sense of calm that transcended her immediate circumstances. Whatever happened, she knew that she had experienced something profound in this place, something that would change her understanding of the world forever. As the day wore on, the whispers in the canyon walls grew stronger and more insistent. Virginia found herself drawn repeatedly to different sections of the carved walls, as if the ancient symbols were trying to communicate something important to her. She began to notice patterns in the artwork that she had missed before, connections between seemingly unrelated images that suggested deeper meanings. The spirits are trying to tell you something, Donna observed, noticing Virginia's fascination with the carvings. Virginia asked, quote 225, quote 226, Donna replied, quote 227. The conversation was interrupted by a shout from Adam, who had been maintaining his vigil at the canyon entrance. Virginia and Donna hurried to join him, and what they saw through his spyglass made Virginia's blood run cold. A line of mounted men was making its way up the mountain trail they had followed the night before, their progress slow but steady as they tracked the fleeing group. Even at this distance, Virginia could make out the distinctive figure of Frank Allen at the head of the column, his bulk unmistakable even through the distortion of the distant lens. How long before they reached the entrance to the canyon? Donna asked. 2 hours, perhaps 3, Adam replied grimly. They are moving faster than I expected. The news galvanized the tribe into immediate action. Within minutes, they had packed their belongings and were ready to continue their journey deeper into the sacred mountains. But Virginia could see the exhaustion in the faces of the children and elderly members of the group, could tell that they were being pushed beyond their limits by the relentless pace of their flight. Perhaps some of us should stay, she suggested. Create a diversion to slow down the pursuit while the others escape. No, Adam said firmly. We stay together. These mountains are too dangerous to face alone, and separation would only make us all more vulnerable. His words carried the weight of absolute authority, and Virginia did not argue further. But she could not shake the feeling that their group was too large and too slow to evade their pursuers indefinitely, that something would have to change if they were to avoid being overtaken. They left the ruins and continued deeper into the canyon, following a path that grew increasingly narrow and treacherous as it wound higher into the mountains. The walls on either side pressed closer together, and the sky above became a thin ribbon of blue barely visible between the towering stone faces. The path they followed began to climb more steeply, carved into the rock face in a series of switchbacks that required careful navigation. Virginia found herself breathing heavily in the thin air, her legs aching from the constant upward struggle. Behind her, she could hear the labored breathing of the tribal elders and the quiet whimpers of children who were being pushed beyond their endurance. We cannot maintain this pace much longer, she said to Adam during one of their brief rests. I know, he replied, his own face showing the strain of their desperate flight. But we have no choice. If we slow down, they will catch us. As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant voices echoed up from the canyon below. Frank Allen's men had found the entrance to the sacred passage and were beginning their pursuit in earnest. The voices carried clearly in the thin mountain air, rough and commanding as the searchers organized themselves for the climb ahead. Quote 238. Adam commanded, and the tribe resumed their desperate ascent. The path grew even more treacherous as they climbed higher, with sections where the carved steps had crumbled away entirely, forcing them to edge along narrow ledges with nothing but empty air beneath their feet. Virginia pressed herself against the rock wall, fighting vertigo as she inched her way across gaps that seemed impossible to navigate. One of the tribal children, a girl of perhaps 8 years, stumbled on a loose stone and nearly fell from the path. Only the quick reflexes of her mother saved her from plummeting into the abyss below, but the incident served as a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. Quote 239. Donna said, pointing ahead to where the canyon wall was broken by what appeared to be another narrow cleft. But even as she spoke, shouts erupted from below, as Frank Allen's men caught sight of their quarry high above on the canyon wall. Virginia looked down to see tiny figures pointing upward, their voices carrying clearly in the still air as they called out the discovery to their companions. There she is! The words echoed off the canyon walls, distorted but unmistakable. The Anderson woman! She's with the Indians! More shouts followed as the pursuit intensified, the searchers abandoning caution in their eagerness to close the distance. Virginia could see them beginning to climb the carved path, their progress hampered by unfamiliarity with the route, but aided by their determination and superior numbers. Quickly now, Adam urged, helping the elderly and children navigate the most difficult sections of the path. We must reach the second passage before they get within rifle range. The mention of rifles sent a chill through Virginia as she realized that their pursuers were not simply trying to recapture her, but were prepared to use deadly force to achieve their goals. The knowledge that Frank Allen was willing to risk the lives of innocent tribal members in his quest for revenge added a new dimension of urgency to their flight. They reached the entrance to the second passage just as the first of their pursuers came within shooting distance. The crack in the rock was even narrower than the first, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through, but it offered their only hope of escape from the trap that was closing around them. Go, Adam commanded, pushing Virginia toward the opening. Get inside and keep moving. Do not stop for anything. Virginia hesitated, reluctant to leave him exposed to the danger from below. What about you? I will hold them off as long as possible, he replied, already positioning himself behind a boulder that would provide some protection from rifle fire. Give you time to get clear. The first shots rang out as Virginia squeezed into the narrow passage, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. She could hear Adam returning fire with his own rifle, the sharp crack of his weapon punctuated by the whistle of bullets striking stone near his position. The passage was even more claustrophobic than the first, with walls that seemed to press in from all sides, and a ceiling so low that she had to duck to avoid striking her head. Behind her, she could hear the other members of the tribe squeezing through the opening one by one, their progress agonizingly slow as they navigated the narrow confines. More gunfire erupted from the canyon behind them, followed by angry shouts as Frank Allen's men realized that their quarry was escaping through another hidden route. Virginia could hear them arguing among themselves about whether to follow, their voices carrying clearly through the thin rock walls of the passage. Quote 250, one voice declared. Quote 251, quote 252. Frank Allen's distinctive voice replied, find another way to cut them off. They can't run forever. The words sent a chill through Virginia as she realized that their escape through the second passage was only temporary. Frankie Allen, I see, was right. They could not run forever, and he had the resources and determination to continue the hunt indefinitely. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the heart of the mountain like the burrow of some enormous creature. Virginia's shoulders ached from being constantly hunched over, and her knees were scraped raw from crawling through sections where the ceiling dropped too low for walking. Finally, after what felt like hours of torturous progress, she saw light ahead and emerged into another hidden canyon. This one was smaller than the first, more intimate in scale, but no less magnificent in its ancient beauty. Waterfalls cascaded down the walls on all sides, creating a constant symphony of falling water that masked any sounds from the outside world. The tribe members emerged from the passage one by one, their faces showing the strain of their ordeal, but also relief at having escaped immediate capture. Last to appear was Adam, his rifle still in his hands and his clothes torn from his desperate crawl through the narrow confines. Virginia asked anxiously. "What time 55?" Adam replied grimly. Quote two if it's we. Quote Tonan, quote Hanan, Adam said. Quote Fonton. The comparison to her former prison sent a shudder through Virginia, but she forced herself to focus on their current situation rather than dwelling on past horrors. They were alive and free for the moment, and that was more than she had dared hope for during the darkest days of her captivity. Donna led them to a sheltered area near one of the waterfalls, where ancient ruins provided both concealment and protection from the elements. The structures here were different from those in the first canyon, more elaborate and better preserved, as if this place had been considered especially sacred by whoever had built them. Quote 260, Donna announced. Quote 261. But even as she spoke, Virginia could see the worry in her eyes. Being trapped in a canyon with only one exit was a double-edged blessing, providing security but also eliminating any possibility of escape if their pursuers found a way to breach their defenses. As they settled into their temporary refuge, Virginia found herself studying the ancient carvings that covered the walls around them. These were different from the ones in the first canyon, more focused on themes of transformation and renewal rather than creation and destruction. There were images of people changing into animals, of spirits emerging from the earth and sky, of death giving way to rebirth in an endless cycle. Quote 262. She asked Donna as they prepared their meager evening meal. Quote 263. Donna replied cryptically. Quote 264. The explanation raised more questions than it answered. But Virginia was beginning to understand that direct answers were not always possible when dealing with the mysteries of the sacred canyons. Some truths could only be experienced, not explained. Night fell over the hidden canyon with a suddenness that caught Virginia off guard. One moment the walls were bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, and the next they were shrouded in darkness so complete that she could barely see her own hands. The waterfalls continued their eternal song, but their sound seemed different in the darkness, more ominous and mysterious. The tribe gathered around a small fire built in the shelter of the ancient ruins, its light carefully shielded to avoid detection by any watchers who might be positioned on the canyon rim high above. The flames cast dancing shadows on the carved walls, bringing the ancient figures to life in ways that made Virginia's skin crawl with unease. "Tell me about Frank Allen," Donna said to Virginia as they shared their simple meal. "What drives a man to pursue another human being with such determination?" Virginia considered the question carefully, trying to understand the motivations of the man who had become her nemesis. "He is a man who has never been denied anything he wanted," she said finally. "Money, power, influence, they have all come easily to him. I think my refusal to marry him was the first time anyone had ever said no to him, and he cannot accept it. It is more than that," Adam added quietly. "Frank Allen sees you as property that has been stolen from him. In his mind, he has a right to you that supersedes your own wishes or desires." The analysis was uncomfortably accurate, and Virginia felt a familiar surge of anger at the injustice of her situation. She had committed no crime other than asserting her right to choose her own fate, yet she was being hunted like a criminal through the wilderness. "What will he do if he catches us?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He will make an example of you," Adam replied grimly. "He will want to show other women what happens to those who defy the established order. Your punishment will be public and severe, designed to discourage others from following your example." The thought of being dragged back to Cedar Falls in chains, of being subjected to whatever humiliation Frank Allen might devise, was almost unbearable. But Virginia found that her fear was tempered by a growing sense of defiance, a determination not to submit to his will regardless of the consequences. "I will not go back willingly," she declared. "If he wants me, he will have to take me by force." "It may come to that," Adam agreed, "but we are not helpless here. These canyons have their own defenses, their own ways of protecting those who seek sanctuary within their walls." As if summoned by his words, the whispers in the canyon walls grew stronger, more insistent. Virginia could hear voices speaking in languages she did not recognize, could feel the presence of unseen watchers in the shadows beyond the firelight. The sensation was both comforting and terrifying, as if ancient powers were stirring to life in response to the threat that menaced their sacred spaces. "They are coming," one of the tribal scouts reported, appearing suddenly at the edge of the firelight like a ghost materialized from the darkness. The words sent a chill through the gathered group, though Virginia noticed that Donna and the other tribal members showed less fear than she might have expected. There was something in their manner that suggested they had been expecting this development, that they had prepared for it in ways she did not yet understand. "How many?" Adam asked, already reaching for his rifle. 12 men, the scout replied. "They found a way down from the rim, using ropes and climbing equipment. They will reach the canyon floor within the hour." 12 armed men against their small group of women, children, and elders seemed like impossible odds. But Virginia noticed that Adam did not seem overly concerned by the numbers. He was checking his weapons with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced such situations before and survived them. "What do we do?" Virginia asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We trust in the old powers," Donna replied, rising from her place by the fire, "and we prepare to defend what is sacred." What followed was unlike anything Virginia had ever witnessed. The tribal members began to move through the ruins with purposeful intent, lighting torches and placing them in specific locations among the ancient stones. As the flames sprang to life, the carvings on the walls seemed to come alive, shifting and moving in ways that defied rational explanation. Donna began to chant in her native language, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to resonate with the very stones around them. The other tribal members joined in, their voices blending into a harmony that made the air itself vibrate with power. Virginia felt something stirring within her as the chanting continued, a sense of connection to forces far older and more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. The whispers in the walls grew louder, more insistent, until she could almost understand what they were saying. "What is happening?" she asked Adam, who was watching the proceedings with an expression of awe and concern. "They are awakening the guardians," he replied quietly, "calling upon the ancient spirits to defend their sacred places. I have heard stories of such things, but I have never seen it done." The sound of voices echoing from the canyon entrance interrupted their conversation, harsh and commanding, as Frank Allen's men made their final approach. Virginia could hear them arguing among themselves about the best way to assault the ruins, their confidence apparently shaken by the strange lights and sounds emanating from the ancient structures. Quote 288. Frank Allen's voice commanded, "Surround the ruins. Do not let any of them escape." But as his men moved to comply with the order, something extraordinary began to happen. The very air in the canyon seemed to thicken, becoming almost solid in places where the intruders tried to pass. Virginia watched in amazement as several of the men stumbled and fell, as if they were walking through invisible barriers that existed only for them. The carvings on the walls began to glow with their own inner light, pulsing in rhythm with Donna's chanting. Figures seemed to detach themselves from the stone surfaces, moving with fluid grace through the darkness to intercept the advancing searchers. Chapter 290. One of Frank Allen's men cried out, his voice high with terror as he fired his rifle at something Virginia could not see. The gunshot echoed through the canyon like thunder, but it was followed immediately by a scream of pure terror as the shooter was lifted from his feet by invisible hands and flung against the canyon wall with bone-crushing force. Chaos erupted among the searchers as they found themselves under attack by enemies they could not see or understand. Virginia watched in fascination and horror as grown men fled in panic from threats that existed only in the realm of spirit and shadow. "This is impossible," Frank Allen roared, his voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. "They are just Indians and a runaway woman. We are civilized men with superior weapons." But his protests were lost in the growing cacophony of supernatural warfare that raged through the sacred canyon. The ancient guardians had awakened to defend their domain, and no amount of civilization or superior firepower could stand against powers that predated human memory. Virginia felt herself being drawn into the spiritual battle, felt the whispers in the walls calling to something deep within her soul. Without conscious thought, she found herself adding her voice to Donna's chanting, speaking words in a language she had never learned but somehow understood. The effect was immediate and profound. The lights in the canyon blazed brighter, the invisible guardians grew stronger, and Frank Allen's remaining men broke and ran in terror from forces they could neither comprehend nor combat. "Fall back," Frank Allen commanded, his own voice now edged with fear. "Retreat to the canyon entrance. We will wait for reinforcements." But as his men attempted to withdraw, they found their escape route blocked by the same supernatural forces that had repelled their attack. The canyon had become a trap, its ancient powers aroused to fury by the violation of sacred ground. Virginia watched through the dancing flames and swirling shadows as Frank Allen himself was confronted by something that made him stumble backward in terror, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers as he faced powers beyond his comprehension or control. The battle raged through the night, a conflict between the old ways and the new, between greed and sanctity, between those who would dominate and those who sought only to protect what was sacred. And as dawn began to break over the canyon walls, it became clear that the ancient powers had prevailed. Frank Allen and his surviving men huddled at the canyon entrance, trapped by forces they could not understand and afraid to venture deeper into the sacred space. Their superior numbers and weapons had proven useless against enemies that existed beyond the reach of bullets and the comprehension of rational minds. Virginia stood among the ruins where she had found sanctuary, her voice hoarse from hours of chanting in languages that should have been foreign to her tongue. Around her, the tribal members continued their vigil, maintaining the spiritual barriers that held their enemies at bay. The immediate danger had passed, but Virginia knew that the confrontation was far from over. Frank Allen would not give up easily, would not accept defeat at the hands of what he would undoubtedly dismiss as primitive superstition. He would regroup, would return with more men and different tactics, would find a way to breach the defenses that protected the sacred canyon. But for now, in this moment between darkness and dawn, Virginia Anderson stood free among the ancient stones. Her voice joined with those who had chosen to protect her. Her spirit awakened to powers she had never dreamed existed. The woman who had been chained in the church basement was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had touched the very foundations of the world and found them responsive to her call. The sun rose over the canyon walls, painting the ancient carvings in shades of gold and crimson, and Virginia knew that whatever came next, she would face it not as a victim, but as a woman who had learned to call upon forces older than civilization itself. The dawn light revealed the full extent of what had transpired in the sacred canyon during the night. Frank Allen's men huddled at the narrow entrance like beaten animals, their weapons abandoned and their faces marked by terror that went deeper than physical fear. Some wept openly, others stared with vacant eyes at sights that had shattered their understanding of the world. The supernatural battle had left its mark on every soul present, changing them in ways that could never be undone. Virginia stood among the ancient ruins, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her spirit blazing with newfound power. The chanting had awakened something within her that had been sleeping since birth, a connection to forces that predated civilization itself. She could still feel the presence of the guardians in the carved stones around her, could sense their approval and protection flowing through the very air she breathed. Quote 295, Donna said quietly, approaching Virginia with reverence that had not been there before. The transformation was evident, not just in Virginia's bearing, but in the way the other tribal members looked at her. Where once they had seen a frightened white woman fleeing from her oppressors, they now saw someone who had been touched by the sacred powers of their ancestors. The change was profound and irreversible, marking her as forever different from the woman who had been chained in the church basement. Adam watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, as he observed the aftermath of the spiritual battle. Virginia could sense his uncertainty, his struggle to understand what she had become during those hours of supernatural warfare. The woman he had rescued was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to make the air shimmer with barely contained energy. What happens now? Virginia asked, her voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the stone walls around them. Now we wait, Donna replied. The Guardians have driven back the immediate threat, but they cannot hold these men forever. Eventually the barriers will weaken, and your enemies will be free to leave this place. As if summoned by her words, Frank Allen's voice echoed across the canyon floor, hoarse with exhaustion and defeat, but still carrying the authority of a man accustomed to commanding others. Quote 300, he called out, his words directed toward the ruins where Virginia stood. Quote through Oiman. His threat hung in the morning air like a poisonous cloud, reminding everyone present that their victory was temporary at best. Frank Allen might be beaten for the moment, but his resources were vast and his determination absolute. He would indeed return, and when he did, he would be prepared for the supernatural defenses that had repelled his first assault. Ousfrali Bayam, Virginia said, and there was something in her tone that made even Adam take a step backward. Quote, the confidence in her voice was absolute, but Virginia could see the concern in Adam's eyes as he studied her transformed features. The spiritual battle had changed her in ways that went beyond the merely physical, and she could tell that he was struggling to reconcile the woman he had rescued with the powerful being she had become. We should leave this place, he said carefully, as if speaking to a wild animal that might turn dangerous at any moment. The canyon is sacred, but it is also a trap. If Frank Allen returns with enough men, he could seal the entrance and starve us out. No, Virginia replied firmly, I will not run anymore. I will not spend my life fleeing from men who believe they have the right to own me like property. This ends here in this sacred place, where the old powers still hold sway. Her declaration sent a ripple of unease through the gathered tribal members, who understood better than Adam the implications of what she was proposing. To make a final stand in the sacred canyon would be to risk not only their own lives, but the sanctity of the ancient ruins themselves. It was a decision that could not be made lightly or by a single individual, no matter how touched by spiritual power she might be. The choice is not yours alone to make, Donna said gently but firmly. This canyon belongs to my people, has been our sanctuary for generations beyond counting. We cannot allow it to become a battlefield, no matter how just your cause might be. The rebuke was mild but unmistakable, and Virginia felt a flush of shame at her presumption. In her newfound power, she had forgotten that she was still a guest in this sacred place, dependent on the goodwill and protection of people who had already risked much to help her. You are right, she admitted, bowing her head in acknowledgement of her error. I spoke from anger and pride, not wisdom. The decision must be yours to make. Donna studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity of her words against the spiritual transformation that had marked her so profoundly. Finally, she nodded in apparent satisfaction. The spirits have chosen you for a purpose, she said, but that purpose may not be what you think it is. Sometimes the greatest power lies not in making a stand, but in knowing when to yield, when to bend like the willow rather than break like the oak. The analogy was apt, Virginia realized, though it went against every instinct that had been awakened within her during the night's supernatural battle. The power she had touched was intoxicating, making her feel invincible and righteous in equal measure. But Donna's words reminded her that true strength sometimes required restraint, that wisdom often lay in choosing battles carefully rather than fighting them all. As they debated their next course of action, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon entrance, followed by new voices that carried the authority of official business. Virginia felt her heart sink as she recognized the implications of these fresh arrivals. Frank Allen had not been idle during the night, had used the time to summon reinforcements of a very different nature. This is United States Marshal Ethan Williams, a strong voice called out across the canyon floor. I am here on official business with warrants for the arrest of Virginia Anderson and any persons found to be harboring a fugitive from justice. The arrival of federal law enforcement changed everything, transforming what had been a private dispute into a matter of official legal consequence. Virginia felt the weight of civilization pressing down upon the sacred canyon, threatening to crush the ancient powers beneath the machinery of territorial justice. Show yourself, Miss Anderson, Marshal Williams continued. You are charged with theft of property, destruction of church assets, and conspiracy to commit acts of violence against lawful citizens. Surrender yourself peacefully, and no harm will come to those who have given you shelter. The charges were absurd, Virginia knew, trumped up by Frank Allen and Father Cooper to give their persecution the appearance of legal legitimacy. But the presence of a federal marshal made them real in ways that mattered, regardless of their actual merit. What do we do? She asked Donna, her newfound confidence shaken by this development. We trust in the old ways, Donna replied, but Virginia could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The tribal leader was wise in the ways of spirits and ancient powers, But federal marshals represented a different kind of authority, one that might not be so easily turned aside by supernatural intervention. Adam had moved to a position where he could observe the new arrivals through his spyglass, and his expression was grim as he studied the force that had assembled at the canyon entrance. 20 men, he reported, all armed, all wearing badges. Frank Allen is with them, along with Father Cooper and several others I do not recognize. They have supplies for an extended siege. The news was worse than Virginia had feared. A federal marshal with a warrant was bad enough, but a force of 20 armed lawmen could not be dismissed as easily as Frank Allen's hired thugs had been. These were men sworn to uphold the law, however twisted that law might be in its application. Virginia said desperately, but even as she spoke, she could feel the spiritual energy in the canyon beginning to ebb. The ancient powers had expended enormous effort in repelling the first assault, and they needed time to recover their strength. The arrival of so many armed men, backed by the authority of territorial law, was testing the limits of what the Guardians could accomplish. Quote 324. Donna explained sadly. Quote 325. As if to confirm her words, Marshal Williams called out again, his voice carrying new authority and determination. Quote 326. The ultimatum hung in the morning air like a death sentence, final and uncompromising in its certainty. Virginia looked around at the ancient ruins that had become her sanctuary, at the tribal members who had risked everything to protect her, at Adam who had given up his own safety to secure her freedom. The weight of responsibility for their welfare pressed down upon her like a physical burden. Quote, she said quietly. Quote, the woman said firmly, speaking for the first time since the marshal's arrival. If you surrender now, everything we have endured will be meaningless. Frank Allen will have won, and other women will suffer the same fate you escaped. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, but Virginia could see the cost of that conviction in his eyes. He was prepared to fight and die for her freedom, but she was no longer certain that such a sacrifice was justified. The hour that Marshal Williams had given them passed with agonizing slowness, each minute marked by the steady approach of armed men preparing for battle. Virginia could see them through gaps in the canyon walls, positioning themselves for an assault that would leave no avenue of escape. The sight of so many weapons trained on their sanctuary filled her with a despair that threatened to overwhelm the spiritual strength she had gained during the night. There must be another way, she said to Donna as they watched the preparations below. Some path that does not lead to bloodshed and death. The old spirits speak of transformation, Donna replied thoughtfully, of becoming something new, rather than fighting to remain what we have always been. Perhaps that is the answer you seek. The cryptic response offered little comfort, but Virginia found herself drawn to the ancient carvings that covered the canyon walls. The images seemed different now, charged with new meaning that she had not perceived before. Where once she had seen only historical records of past events, she now saw prophecies of change and renewal, of death giving way to rebirth in forms that transcended the limitations of mortal existence. What are you suggesting? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The Guardians offer a choice, Donna said carefully, to remain as you are and face whatever fate awaits, or to become something more, something that cannot be chained or caged or owned by any mortal power. The implications of such a transformation were staggering, involving a fundamental change in the very nature of her existence. Virginia had felt the touch of the ancient powers during the spiritual battle, had sensed the vast intelligence that dwelt within the sacred stones. To accept such a change would be to leave behind everything she had ever known, to become something that was no longer entirely human. What would I become? She asked. A guardian yourself, Donna replied, a protector of the sacred places, a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. You would gain power beyond mortal comprehension, but you would also accept responsibilities that would bind you to these mountains forever. The choice was impossible, requiring her to weigh her human desires against the needs of something far greater than herself. As a guardian, she would be free from the threats that Frank Allen and his kind represented, but she would also be separated from the world of ordinary human experience. And Adam, she asked, looking toward the man who had risked everything to secure her freedom. That would be his choice to make, Donna said gently. The transformation is offered to both of you, but it cannot be forced upon anyone. Each must choose freely, understanding the full cost of what they accept or reject. Virginia felt her heart breaking at the thought of losing Adam, of being forced to choose between her love for him and her desire for true freedom. But she also understood that the decision could not be postponed indefinitely. Marshall Williams would not wait much longer, and when he acted, the consequences would be final for everyone in the canyon. "Time's up," the marshal's voice echoed across the canyon floor, carrying the finality of official judgment. Quote 345. The sound of boots on stone began to echo from the canyon entrance as the armed men began their advance. Virginia could see them moving in disciplined formation, their weapons ready and their faces set with the determination of men who believed they were serving justice. The sight filled her with a mixture of fear and rage that threatened to overwhelm her fragile self-control. Quote 346, Donna urged. Quote 347. Virginia looked around at the ancient ruins that had become her sanctuary, at the carved walls that told stories of transformation and renewal, at the faces of the tribal members who had risked everything to protect her. Then she looked at Adam, whose dark eyes held a depth of understanding that spoke of shared hardship and mutual devotion. She asked him. Adam was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the advancing lawman and back again. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of their existence. He said quietly, quote 351. His words sent a surge of relief and love through Virginia's heart, but they also carried the weight of enormous responsibility. The choice they were making would affect not only their own lives, but the lives of everyone in the canyon, the sanctity of the sacred places, and the balance between the old ways and the new. "We accept," Virginia said, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor despite its quiet tone. "We choose transformation." The effect was immediate and profound. The air in the canyon began to shimmer with energy that made Virginia's skin tingle and her hair stand on end. The ancient carvings on the walls blazed with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself, and the whispers that had haunted the sacred places rose to a crescendo of voices speaking in languages older than human memory. Virginia felt the change beginning within her, starting as a warmth in her chest that spread outward through her entire body. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual leaves on trees hundreds of feet away, could perceive colors that had no names in any human language. Her hearing expanded until she could detect the heartbeats of the advancing lawmen, could sense their fear and confusion as they encountered forces beyond their comprehension. Beside her, Adam was undergoing his own transformation, his human features taking on an otherworldly quality that spoke of wisdom gained through communion with ancient powers. His eyes had become deeper, more knowing, as if he could see through the veils that separated the physical world from the realm of spirit. The advancing lawmen stopped abruptly as they encountered the wave of supernatural energy that radiated from the ruins. Virginia could see them struggling against invisible barriers, their weapons useless against forces that existed beyond the reach of bullets and badges. Some fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the presence of powers that dwarfed their human authority. Marshall Williams called out, his voice high with fear and confusion. Code 355. But his questions went unanswered as the transformation reached its climax. Virginia felt her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her physical form, connecting her to the vast network of spiritual energy that flowed through the sacred mountains. She could sense every living thing within miles, could feel the pulse of the earth itself beneath her feet. The woman who had been chained in the church basement was gone forever, replaced by something that transcended the limitations of mortal existence. Virginia Anderson had become Virginia the Guardian, protector of the sacred places and voice for those who could not speak for themselves. Adam's transformation was equally profound, his human concerns and fears replaced by a deeper understanding of his role in the cosmic balance. He had become Adam the Sentinel, her partner in guardianship and her companion in the eternal watch over the ancient powers. Together they rose from the ruins where their human selves had knelt, their transformed bodies radiating light that made the lawmen shield their eyes and stumble backward in terror. The canyon walls themselves seemed to sing with joy at their transformation, the ancient stones recognizing the return of guardians to protect the sacred places. "Go," Virginia's voice carried clearly to Marshall Williams and his men. though it now held harmonics that resonated with the very foundations of the mountain. Book 357. The lawmen needed no further encouragement to retreat. They fled from the canyon in disorder, their badges and warrants useless against powers that recognized no earthly authority. Even Marshal Williams abandoned his duty in the face of forces that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. As the last of the intruders disappeared from view, Virginia turned to survey her new domain. The sacred canyon stretched before her, beautiful and eternal, protected now by guardians who would never tire, never age, never abandon their watch. The tribal members who had risked everything to help her bowed deeply, recognizing the profound change that had taken place. Quote 358, Donna said, her voice filled with reverence and satisfaction. Quote 359, Virginia felt the truth of those words in the very core of her being. The transformation had given her everything she had ever truly wanted. Freedom from the constraints of human society, power to protect those who needed protection, and the companionship of someone who understood and shared her deepest values. But the choice had also come with costs that she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer entirely human, could no longer move freely in the world of ordinary mortals. Her existence was now bound to the sacred places, her purpose defined by responsibilities that would last for eternity. Quote 360. Adam asked as if sensing her thoughts. Virginia considered the question carefully, weighing what she had gained against what she had lost. The woman who had been chained in the basement would never again know the simple pleasures of human existence, would never bear children or grow old surrounded by family. But that same woman had also lived in constant fear, had been subject to the whims and desires of men who saw her as property rather than person. Quote 361, she said finally. Quote 362, the words carried the weight of absolute conviction, resonating through the canyon like a declaration of independence from all the forces that had sought to control and diminish her. She was Virginia the Guardian now, protector of the sacred places and champion of those who had nowhere else to turn. In the weeks that followed their transformation, Virginia and Adam settled into their new roles as guardians of the sacred places. The canyon became their home in ways that transcended mere physical residence. Their consciousness intertwined with the ancient stones and flowing waters that had sheltered them during their time of greatest need. They learned to communicate with the spirits that dwelt within the carved walls, to understand the complex web of relationships that bound the sacred sites together across the vast mountain wilderness. The tribal members who had risked everything to help them became their closest allies and advisors, teaching them the old ways and helping them understand the full scope of their new responsibilities. Donna served as their primary guide, her wisdom and experience invaluable as they navigated the complex transition from human to guardian. Quote 363. She explained during one of their evening conversations beside the eternal fires that now burned within the ancient ruins. Quote 364. The news was both exciting and daunting, expanding their area of responsibility far beyond the single canyon where they had undergone their change. Virginia found herself able to sense these distant sites, to feel their needs and concerns as if they were extensions of her own being. The network of sacred places formed a vast web of spiritual energy that stretched across the entire mountain range, each site connected to all the others in ways that defied ordinary understanding. Quote 365. Adam asked, his own awareness expanding to encompass the growing network. Quote 366. Donna replied. Quote 367. The scope of their new responsibilities was overwhelming, but Virginia found that her transformed consciousness was equal to the task. She could monitor dozens of sites simultaneously, sensing threats and responding to needs with a speed and efficiency that would have been impossible in her human form. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, giving her a sense of purpose that she had never experienced before. Their first major test as guardians came when a group of prospectors attempted to establish a mining operation in one of the sacred valleys. The men were not malicious in their intent, merely ignorant of the spiritual significance of the land they sought to exploit. But their presence threatened to disrupt forces that had remained in balance for centuries, potentially causing damage that could never be repaired. Virginia and Adam responded to the threat with the full power of their transformed abilities, appearing to the prospectors as figures of light and shadow that spoke with voices like thunder and wind. The encounter was brief but decisive, the miners fleeing in terror after witnessing demonstrations of power that challenged their understanding of reality. Quote 368, Adam observed after the incident. Quote 369. His words reminded Virginia of the delicate balance they needed to maintain between protection and oppression, between defending the sacred places and respecting the rights of ordinary mortals to live their lives. The transformation had given them enormous power, but it had also burdened them with the responsibility to use that power wisely. News of their transformation and the supernatural events in the sacred canyon spread quickly through the surrounding territories, carried by the fleeing lawmen and the terrified prospectors. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legends that spoke of spirits and demons, of ancient powers awakened to defend the wilderness against the encroachment of civilization. Frank Allen's response to these stories was predictably violent and obsessive. Unable to accept that his quarry had moved beyond his reach, he organized expedition after expedition into the mountains, hiring guides and trackers and even bringing in supposed experts in supernatural phenomena. Each attempt ended in failure and often in tragedy, as the sacred places themselves seemed to turn against those who approached with hostile intent. Father Cooper proved more cunning in his approach, recognizing that direct confrontation with supernatural forces was unlikely to succeed. Instead, he began a campaign of propaganda and religious fervor, preaching sermons that portrayed Virginia and Adam as demons who had seduced innocent tribal members into devil worship. His efforts found fertile ground among those who feared the growing influence of the sacred places and the challenges they posed to established authority. "They are organizing against us," Donna warned during one of their regular meetings. "Father Cooper has convinced the territorial governor to declare the sacred sites a threat to public order. There is talk of bringing in the army to clear the mountains of what they call supernatural influences." The news was deeply troubling, representing a threat that could not be turned aside by demonstrations of power alone. An army would not be easily frightened or discouraged, and the political authority behind such an action would give it a legitimacy that private expeditions lacked. "What do they hope to accomplish?" Virginia asked. "Even an army cannot fight spirits and ancient powers." "They do not need to fight the spirits directly," Donna replied grimly. "They need only destroy the physical sites where the spirits dwell, break the stones and fill the sacred pools, scatter the bones and artifacts that anchor the old powers to this world." The strategy was both simple and devastating in its implications. The sacred places drew their power from the physical structures that had been built and maintained over countless generations. Destroy those structures and the spiritual energy would dissipate, leaving the sites vulnerable to permanent desecration. Virginia felt a surge of protective fury at the thought of such destruction, her transformed consciousness recoiling from the idea of ancient sanctuaries being reduced to rubble by those who could not understand their significance. But she also recognized that raw power alone would not be sufficient to protect the sacred places from such a systematic assault. "We need allies," Adam said, his strategic mind already working on the problem. "People in positions of authority who can counter Father Cooper's influence and prevent military action against the sacred sites." "Where will we find such allies?" Virginia asked. "Most of those in power share Father Cooper's fear of anything they cannot control or understand." The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the tribal members who had taken refuge in the sacred canyon was an elderly man named Ronald Smith, whose mixed heritage had allowed him to move freely between the white and Indian worlds for most of his life. He had served as a scout for the army, a translator for government officials, and a mediator in countless disputes between settlers and tribal groups. "There are those in the territorial capital who remember the old treaties," Ronald explained during a council meeting held in the ancient ruins. "Men who understand that the sacred sites were specifically protected under agreements signed by their own government. If we can reach them, if we can make them understand what is at stake, they might be willing to intervene." The plan that emerged from their discussions was both simple and dangerous. Ronald would travel to the territorial capital carrying evidence of the government's treaty obligations, while Virginia and Adam would use their powers as guardians to protect the sacred sites from immediate threats. The success of their efforts would depend on timing, diplomacy, and the willingness of distant officials to honor commitments made by their predecessors. Quote 382, Virginia declared, surprising everyone present with her announcement. Quote 383, Donna protested. Quote 384, quote 5, Virginia replied. Quote 386, the technique she described was advanced even by the standards of guardian abilities, requiring a level of spiritual control that few had ever achieved. But Virginia felt confident in her growing mastery of her transformed nature, certain that she could maintain her dual existence long enough to accomplish their goals. The journey to the territorial capital took place on multiple levels simultaneously. Ronald traveled the physical roads and mountain passes, carrying documents and artifacts that proved the treaty protections for the sacred sites. Virginia accompanied him as a projection of spiritual energy, invisible to ordinary sight but capable of influencing events in subtle but important ways. Their first challenge came when they reached the town of Cedar Falls, where Frank L. Lannon and Father Cooper had established what amounted to a military headquarters for their campaign against the sacred places. The streets were filled with armed men and religious zealots, all convinced that they were engaged in a holy war against supernatural evil. Virginia watched from her spiritual vantage point as Ronald was recognized and surrounded by hostile crowds. The situation quickly turned dangerous, with voices calling for his immediate arrest as a collaborator with demonic forces. Only Virginia's intervention, manifesting as a sudden windstorm that scattered the mob, allowed Ronald to escape and continue his journey. They are more organized than we thought, Virginia reported to Adam through their Guardian connection. Father Cooper has turned the entire region against us, convincing people that the sacred places represent an existential threat to their way of life. The propaganda campaign had been devastatingly effective, transforming a personal dispute over Virginia's refusal to marry Frank Allen into a broader conflict between civilization and wilderness, Christianity and paganism, order and chaos. The stakes had grown far beyond anything they had originally imagined. The territorial capital proved to be a maze of political intrigue and competing interests, where Ronald's message of treaty obligations and sacred site protections was met with skepticism and outright hostility. Virginia's spiritual presence allowed her to observe meetings and conversations that would have been closed to any ordinary petitioner, giving her insight into the complex web of relationships that govern territorial politics. The governor himself, she discovered, was deeply conflicted about the situation. He recognized the legal validity of the treaty protections, but was under enormous pressure from influential citizens like Frank Allen to take decisive action against what they portrayed as a supernatural threat to public order. The political calculations were complex, involving federal oversight, territorial autonomy, and the competing interests of various constituencies. Quote 389. Virginia overheard him telling his advisors during a closed-door meeting. Quote 39. The characterization of their guardianship as a religious uprising was both accurate and misleading, Virginia realized. While their transformation had spiritual dimensions, their primary concern was protection of the sacred places rather than conversion of others to their beliefs. But in the charged atmosphere of territorial politics, such distinctions were easily lost. Her observations revealed that their best hope lay with the territorial attorney, a woman named Susan Perez who had built her career on strict interpretation of legal documents and federal law. Unlike the governor, she was not subject to the same political pressures and had a reputation for principled decision-making that transcended popular opinion. Virginia decided to take a risk that could either save the sacred places or expose her projected consciousness to destruction. She manifested herself directly to Susan Perez, appearing in the attorney's private office as a figure of light and shadow that spoke with a voice like wind through canyon walls. "I am Virginia Anderson," she said, her transformed presence filling the room with energy that made the very air shimmer. "I am the woman you have heard about, the one who escaped from Frank Allen's persecution and found sanctuary in the sacred places." Susan Perez proved to be made of sterner stuff than most mortals, maintaining her composure despite the supernatural nature of the encounter. "You are the fugitive from Marshall Williams's warrants," she said calmly, "the one charged with theft and destruction of property." "I am the woman who refused to be owned," Virginia replied, the woman who chose transformation over submission, who accepted guardianship of the sacred places rather than bondage to men who saw her as property. The conversation that followed was unlike any Virginia had experienced since her transformation. Susan Perez asked pointed questions about the nature of the sacred places, the extent of the treaty protections, and the legal implications of military action against sites that were specifically protected under federal law. Her approach was analytical rather than emotional, focused on facts and precedents rather than fears and prejudices. The treaties are clear, Susan concluded after reviewing the documents that Ronald had brought. The sacred sites are protected under federal law, and any military action against them would constitute a violation of the United States government's solemn commitments. But the political pressure for such action is enormous. What would it take to prevent military intervention? Virginia asked. A federal court order, Susan replied promptly. Something that would make it clear that any action against the sacred sites would result in federal prosecution of territorial officials. But obtaining such an order would require evidence that the sites are genuinely protected under existing treaties, not just folklore and tribal claims. The challenge was significant, but not insurmountable. Virginia's transformed consciousness gave her access to knowledge and artifacts that had been hidden for generations. Evidence of the sacred place's protected status that went far beyond what Ronald had been able to gather. The question was whether she could manifest such evidence in forms that would be acceptable to federal courts. Over the next several days, Virginia worked with Susan Perez to compile a comprehensive legal case for the protection of the sacred sites. The process required her to delve deep into her guardian knowledge, accessing memories and records that belonged not to her human past, but to the ancient spirits that had chosen her as their vessel. The evidence that emerged was overwhelming, consisting of original treaty documents, surveyor's maps that clearly marked the sacred sites as protected areas, and correspondence between territorial and federal officials that acknowledged the government's obligations. More importantly, Virginia was able to provide testimony from the guardians themselves, spiritual witnesses whose knowledge of events stretched back centuries. This is unprecedented, Susan admitted as they compiled the final documentation. I have never seen a legal case that relied so heavily on supernatural testimony. But the evidence is compelling, and the law is clear. If we can get this before a federal judge, we should be able to stop any military action. The legal brief they submitted was a masterwork of jurisprudence and spiritual advocacy, combining rigorous legal analysis with testimony from sources that transcended ordinary human experience. Virginia's role as a guardian allowed her to provide evidence that no ordinary petitioner could have accessed, while Susan's legal expertise ensured that the presentation met the highest standards of federal court practice. The response was swift and decisive. Within days of the brief's submission, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order that prohibited any military action against the sacred sites pending a full hearing on their protected status. The order was accompanied by a strongly worded statement that reminded territorial officials of their obligations under federal law and the serious consequences of violating treaty commitments. News of the court order reached Frank Allen and Father Cooper just as they were preparing to launch their most ambitious assault on the sacred places. The army units they had convinced the governor to deploy were ordered to stand down, their mission canceled by a federal authority that superseded territorial jurisdiction. Virginia felt the wave of frustration and rage that swept through Cedar Falls as their enemies realized that their legal and political campaign had been outmaneuvered. But she also sensed something more dangerous brewing, a desperation that might drive Frank Allen to actions that went beyond the bounds of law and reason. She warned Adam through their guardian connection. Quote, 405 Hurriet's prediction proved accurate within hours. Unable to use official channels to attack the sacred places, Frank Allen began organizing what he called a, quote, 406 Wano to take direct action against what he portrayed as a supernatural threat to the community. The rhetoric was inflammatory and designed to appeal to the deepest fears and prejudices of the local population. He declared at a rally held in the center of the Cedar Falls. To 408, the response was enthusiastic and terrifying, with hundreds of men volunteering to join what amounted to a private army dedicated to the destruction of the sacred places. Frank Allen had the resources to arm and equip such a force, and his influence was sufficient to ensure that local law enforcement would not interfere with their activities. Virginia realized that their legal victory had only postponed the final confrontation, not prevented it. Frank Allen's militia would not be bound by court orders or treaty obligations, would not hesitate to use whatever violence was necessary to achieve their goals. The sacred places faced their greatest threat yet, one that could not be turned aside by legal briefs or federal judges. "We need to prepare for war," she told Adam as they gathered with their tribal allies in the ancient ruins. Not the kind of war that armies fight, but something deeper and more fundamental, a battle for the very soul of these mountains. The preparations that followed drew upon every aspect of their guardian abilities and the ancient wisdom of the sacred places. Virginia and Adam worked with Donna and the other tribal leaders to awaken dormant sites throughout the mountain range, creating a network of spiritual fortresses that could coordinate their defenses against the coming assault. The work was exhausting and dangerous, requiring them to extend their consciousness across vast distances while maintaining their connection to their primary sanctuary. But gradually they felt the ancient powers stirring to life throughout the mountains, sites that had slept for generations awakening to the call of active guardians. "It is done," Virginia announced, as the last of the distant sites acknowledged their awakening. "The sacred places are united as they have not been for centuries. Whatever Frank Allen brings against us, he will face the full power of the old ways." But even as she spoke, Virginia could sense the magnitude of the force that was assembling against them. Frank Allen's militia had grown to over 1,000 men, armed with modern weapons and driven by a fanaticism that bordered on madness. The coming battle would test the limits of Guardian power and determine whether the ancient ways could survive in a world increasingly dominated by industrial civilization. The final confrontation began at dawn on a crisp autumn morning when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, painting the mountainsides in colors that seemed to echo the spiritual energy flowing through the sacred places. Virginia stood with Adam at the heart of their primary sanctuary, their transformed consciousness reaching out across the network of awakened sites to coordinate the defenses that would determine the fate of the ancient ways. Frank Allen's militia approached from multiple directions, their 1,000-strong force divided into smaller units that sought to overwhelm the sacred places through sheer numbers and coordinated assault. The sight of so many armed men moving through the wilderness with destructive intent filled Virginia with a mixture of sorrow and determination, grief for what was about to be lost and resolve to protect what could still be saved. "They come with dynamite and artillery," Adam reported, his spiritual senses tracking the movement of the attacking force. "Frank Allen means to reduce the sacred sites to rubble, to ensure that nothing remains that could serve as a focus for the old powers." The strategy was both crude and effective, recognizing that the spiritual energy of the sacred places was anchored to physical structures that had been built and maintained over countless generations. Destroy those structures, and the ancient powers would be scattered to the winds, unable to manifest in the physical world with sufficient strength to resist further encroachment. Virginia felt the first explosions as physical blows to her transformed consciousness, each detonation sending waves of pain through the network of connected sites. The militia had begun their assault on the most remote locations, places that were less well defended, but still crucial to the overall integrity of the sacred network. "We cannot protect them all," Donna said grimly, as reports reached them of sites being overrun and destroyed. "There are too many attacks happening simultaneously." The tactical situation was desperate but not hopeless. Virginia's transformation had given her abilities that transcended ordinary limitations, allowing her to project her consciousness across vast distances and manifest with devastating effect wherever her intervention was needed. The question was whether she could be in enough places at once to turn the tide of battle. She announced, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the ancient stones. Quote 418 Ho. The technique was extraordinarily dangerous, requiring her to fragment her transformed identity in ways that could result in permanent dissolution if not carefully managed. But the alternative was to watch helplessly as the sacred places were destroyed one by one, their ancient wisdom lost forever to the march of industrial civilization. Virginia felt herself separating into multiple streams of consciousness, each one carrying a portion of her power and awareness to a different battlefield. The sensation was disorienting and terrifying, like being torn apart and scattered across the mountains. But she maintained her focus on the greater purpose that drove her actions. At the first site under attack, she manifested as a whirlwind of spiritual energy that sent militia members fleeing in terror. Their dynamite charges were scattered by invisible hands, their weapons jammed by forces that existed beyond the reach of mechanical repair. The assault collapsed within minutes, the attackers convinced that they faced demons rather than mortal opponents. But even as she achieved victory at one location, Virginia felt other sites falling to the coordinated assault. Frank Allen had learned from his previous failures, training his men to expect supernatural resistance and providing them with protective talismans and religious symbols that he believed would shield them from spiritual attack. Quote 419 of Virginia reported to Adam as she fought simultaneous battles across a dozen locations. Quote 421. The psychological dimension of the conflict was proving as important as the spiritual one. Frank Allen had successfully convinced his followers that they were engaged in a holy war against demonic forces, giving them the courage to face supernatural phenomena that would normally send ordinary men fleeing in terror. At the canyon where Virginia and Adam had undergone their transformation, the largest contingent of the militia had assembled under Frank Allen's personal command. The sight of their primary sanctuary under direct assault sent waves of fury through Virginia's fragmented consciousness, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. Quote 421, Frank Allen called out as his men positioned their artillery pieces to reduce the ancient ruins to rubble. Quote 422, his words revealed the personal nature of his obsession, the way a simple refusal to marry had grown into a consuming hatred that threatened to destroy everything Virginia had come to love. The man who had once claimed to want her as his wife now sought her complete annihilation, along with anyone and anything that had given her sanctuary. The artillery bombardment that followed was devastating in its intensity and precision. Shell after shell crashed into the ancient ruins, reducing structures that had stood for millennia to piles of broken stone and scattered debris. Virginia felt each impact as a personal wound, her connection to the sacred places making her acutely aware of every detail of their destruction. But the physical destruction of the ruins did not have the effect that Frank Allen had anticipated. Instead of weakening the spiritual defenses of the canyon, the bombardment seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping in the very bedrock beneath the ancient structures. Virginia felt a presence stirring in the depths of the mountain, something vast and primordial that had existed since the world was young. Quote 423, she whispered to Adam as they felt the mountain beginning to tremble beneath their feet. Quote 424, the earthquake that followed was unlike anything in recorded history, a seismic event that seemed to originate not from tectonic forces, but from the conscious will of the mountain itself. The ground beneath Frank Allen's artillery pieces cracked and heaved, swallowing weapons and men alike in chasms that opened and closed with terrifying speed. But the Earth's intervention came at a terrible cost. The spiritual energy required to manifest such physical effects drained the network of sacred places, leaving many sites vulnerable to destruction by the remaining militia units. Virginia felt her fragmented consciousness being pulled in too many directions at once, her ability to coordinate the defense beginning to fail under the enormous strain. With 425 witty, she gasped, her primary manifestation in the canyon flickering as she struggled to maintain her divided presence across the battlefield. With 426 watch, Adam moved to support her, his own guardian abilities focusing on maintaining the coherence of her fragmented consciousness. But even his help was not sufficient to overcome the fundamental mathematics of the situation. They were outnumbered by forces that were willing to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of their destructive goals. The turning point came when Virginia made a decision that would define the rest of her existence as a guardian. Instead of trying to protect all the sacred places simultaneously, she chose to sacrifice the more remote sites in order to concentrate her power on saving the most important locations. The choice was agonizing, requiring her to abandon sanctuaries that had been protected for generations, but it was the only way to prevent total defeat. Quote 427, she commanded through the spiritual network. Quote 428, the strategic withdrawal was executed with precision born of desperation, spiritual energy flowing from the abandoned sites to strengthen the defenses of those that remained. Frank Allen's militia found themselves suddenly unopposed at many locations. their victory coming so easily that some began to suspect a trap. But Frank Allen himself was too consumed with his personal vendetta to question their apparent success. He pressed forward with his assault on the canyon where Virginia and Adam had undergone their transformation, determined to destroy the place where his quarry had found sanctuary and power. "This ends today," he declared as his remaining forces assembled for the final assault. "Today, we rid these mountains of the supernatural plague that has infected them." The final battle for the sacred canyon began as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows among the ruins that Frank Allen's artillery had failed to completely destroy. Virginia and Adam stood together at the heart of their sanctuary, their transformed bodies radiating light that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness of hatred and destruction. Around them, the surviving tribal members had taken defensive positions among the ancient stones, their faces set with the determination of people who had nothing left to lose. Frank Allen's remaining force numbered nearly 500 men, armed with the most modern weapons that money could buy and driven by a fanaticism that had grown more intense with each victory over the outlying sacred sites. They advanced in disciplined formation, their confidence bolstered by the apparent ease with which they had overwhelmed the outer defenses. But as they entered the canyon proper, they encountered resistance unlike anything they had faced before. The very air seemed to thicken around them, making each step forward a struggle against invisible forces that pressed back with increasing intensity. Their weapons began to malfunction, firing wild or jamming entirely as the spiritual energy of the place interfered with the mechanical systems. "Press forward," Frank Allen commanded. His voice echoing off the canyon walls with desperate authority. "Do not let their tricks discourage you. They are only illusions, smoke and mirrors designed to frighten the weak-minded." But his men were beginning to waver as they encountered phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality. Shadows moved independently of their sources, voices spoke from empty air, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and flow like water. Several men broke ranks entirely, fleeing back toward the canyon entrance in open panic. Virginia felt the fear and confusion of the attacking force through her guardian senses, but she also sensed something more troubling. Frank Allen himself showed no signs of the terror that was affecting his followers. Instead, his determination seemed to be growing stronger, fed by a hatred so intense that it bordered on madness. "He has protected himself somehow," she told Adam as they watched the militias advance. Quote 434. The observation proved accurate as Frank Allen strode through the supernatural barriers that had stopped his followers, his face set with an expression of triumphant vindication. In his hands, he carried not a conventional weapon, but an ornate cross that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, a perversion of sacred symbols that had been twisted to serve destructive purposes. "Utoput 435 on," he called out as he approached the ruins where Virginia and Adam stood. Quote 436. The cross in his hands began to glow with malevolent light, its perverted energy creating a zone of spiritual disruption that allowed his men to advance despite the canyon's defenses. Virginia realized with growing horror that Frank Allen had somehow acquired a weapon specifically designed to combat guardian powers, a tool that could neutralize the very abilities that made her transformation meaningful. "Where did you get that?" she demanded, her voice carrying harmonics that should have sent any mortal fleeing in terror. "From those who understand the true nature of your evil," Frank Allen replied with satisfaction. "There are powers in this world that oppose the darkness you represent, forces that have been preparing for this confrontation since the moment you chose to ally yourself with demons." The revelation that he had supernatural allies of his own was deeply disturbing, suggesting that the conflict over the sacred places was part of a larger struggle between opposing spiritual forces. Virginia had assumed that their enemies were motivated purely by greed and prejudice, but Frank Allen's words implied a more complex and dangerous situation. The battle that followed was unlike anything Virginia had experienced since her transformation. Frank Allen's corrupted cross created fields of spiritual disruption that interfered with her guardian abilities, forcing her to rely on more basic forms of power that left her vulnerable to conventional weapons. His men, emboldened by their leader's apparent immunity to supernatural attack, pressed forward with renewed confidence. Adam fought beside her with desperate courage, his own guardian powers struggling against the disruptive effects of Frank Allen's weapon. Together, they managed to hold back the initial assault, but Virginia could feel their strength being steadily drained by the effort required to maintain their defenses. "The cross is the key," Adam gasped between attacks. "If we can destroy it, the spiritual disruption will end and our full powers will return." But the weapon was well protected, surrounded by Frank Allen's most loyal followers who had been specifically trained to guard against supernatural assault. Any attempt to reach it would require them to expose themselves to concentrated fire from dozens of rifles, a risk that could prove fatal even to transformed beings. The tactical situation continued to deteriorate as more of Frank Allen's men managed to penetrate the canyon's weakened defenses. The tribal members who had taken refuge in the sacred place fought with desperate courage, but they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by enemies who showed no mercy for those they considered allies of demons. Virginia watched in horror as Donna fell beneath a volley of rifle fire, the wise woman who had guided her transformation, dying in defense of the sacred places she had protected all her life. The loss sent waves of grief and rage through Virginia's consciousness, threatening to overwhelm the careful control that kept her guardian powers focused and effective. "She knew this day would come," Adam said quietly, his own voice thick with emotion. "She chose to face it here in the place she loved most, rather than flee to safety elsewhere." The observation was meant to be comforting, but it only highlighted the magnitude of what was being lost in this final battle. The sacred places represented not just spiritual sanctuaries, but entire ways of life, traditions, and wisdom that had been preserved for countless generations. Their destruction would impoverish the world in ways that could never be fully measured or restored. As the battle raged around them, Virginia found herself facing a choice that would define not only her own fate, but the future of all the sacred places. She could continue to fight with conventional guardian powers, accepting the limitations imposed by Frank Allen's disruptive weapon, and hoping that their defenses would hold long enough for help to arrive. Or she could attempt something that had never been tried before, a transformation so profound that it would either save the sacred places or destroy her in the attempt. "Put 444, she told Adam as they fell back toward the innermost sanctuary of the canyon. Quote 444. The technique she described was more legend than established practice, a theoretical possibility that existed at the very limits of Guardian lore. To attempt such a transformation would be to risk not just her own existence, but the spiritual integrity of the entire sacred network. Quote 446. Adam asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected the answer. Quote 447, Virginia replied honestly. Quote 448. The sacrifice would be absolute and irreversible, requiring her to give up everything that made her who she was in order to become something larger and more enduring. But it would also create a form of protection that could not be disrupted by weapons like Frank Allen's cross, a spiritual defense that was literally part of the landscape itself. "I will not let you face that alone," Adam declared, his own resolve crystallizing as he understood the implications of her proposal. "If you choose the final transformation, then I choose it as well. We began this journey together, and we will end it together." Their decision was made in the space between heartbeats, a moment of perfect understanding and shared purpose that transcended the chaos of battle around them. Hand in hand, they walked toward the ancient altar at the center of the canyon, their transformed bodies beginning to glow with light that grew brighter with each step. Frank Allen saw their movement and recognized its significance, his face contorting with rage as he realized that his quarry was about to escape him once again. He raised the corrupted cross above his head, channeling all its disruptive power toward the altar where Virginia and Adam stood. But the final transformation had already begun, and no earthly weapon could stop it now. Virginia felt her individual consciousness dissolving into something vast and eternal, her personal identity becoming part of the collective spirit that had protected these mountains since time immemorial. Beside her, Adam underwent the same profound change, his essence merging with hers and with the sacred places themselves. The effect on the canyon was immediate and overwhelming. The ancient stones blazed with light that made the sun seem dim by comparison, while the very air sang with harmonies that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. Frank Allen's weapon shattered in his hands, its corrupted energy unable to withstand the pure spiritual force that now flowed through every rock and tree. The militia broke and fled in terror as they found themselves facing not individual guardians, but the awakened consciousness of the mountains themselves. The earth beneath their feet trembled with displeasure, while winds carrying voices of ancient wisdom drove them back toward the canyon entrance with irresistible force. Frank Allen himself stood transfixed at the altar, his face frozen in an expression of awe and terror as he finally understood the true magnitude of what he had been fighting. The woman he had sought to own and control had become something that transcended all mortal authority, a force of nature that would protect these sacred places for all eternity. Quote 451, he whispered, her name carrying on the wind like a prayer or a curse. But Virginia Anderson no longer existed as an individual being capable of responding to her old name. She had become Virginia Eternal, guardian spirit of the sacred mountains. Her consciousness merged with the land itself in ways that made her both everywhere and nowhere at once. In the weeks that followed the final transformation, the sacred mountains settled into a new equilibrium that reflected the profound changes that had taken place. The network of protected sites hummed with spiritual energy that could be felt by anyone sensitive to such forces, while the natural world itself seemed more vibrant and alive than it had been in generations. Wildlife returned to areas that had been abandoned, streams ran clearer and stronger, and the very air carried a quality of peace that soothed troubled souls. The tribal members who had survived the battle found themselves changed by their proximity to the transformation. Their own spiritual abilities enhanced and their connection to the sacred places deepened. They became the primary interpreters of the new guardianship, helping visitors understand the significance of what had occurred and maintaining the physical structures that anchored the spiritual forces to the material world. Ronald Smith emerged as their primary spokesman, his mixed heritage and government connections making him an ideal mediator between the transformed sacred places and the outside world. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the legal protections Susan Perez had secured remained in force, while also educating officials about the new realities they faced in the mountains. Quote 452. He explained to a delegation of territorial officials who had come to assess the situation. Quote 453. The demonstration that followed was both subtle and unmistakable. As the officials toured the canyon where the final transformation had taken place, they encountered phenomena that left no doubt about the reality of the spiritual forces at work. Tools moved by themselves to repair damage from the battle, water flowed uphill to fill ceremonial pools, and voices speaking in harmonious whispers provided guidance and instruction to those who listened with open hearts. Frank Allen himself had vanished in the aftermath of the final battle, his fate unknown, but his threat permanently ended. Some claimed he had been consumed by the spiritual forces he had tried to destroy, while others insisted he had simply fled the territory in recognition of his complete defeat. The truth remained a mystery, but his absence brought a peace to the region that had not been known for years. Father Cooper's response to the transformation was characteristically complex and self-serving. Unable to deny the reality of what had occurred, he began preaching sermons that portrayed the events as a divine intervention, claiming that God had chosen to protect the sacred places from those who would desecrate them. His theological gymnastics were impressive, if not entirely convincing, but they served to reduce opposition to the new guardianship among the more religiously minded settlers. The territorial governor found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge the reality of supernatural forces that existed beyond his authority or control. The federal court orders that protected the sacred sites remained in effect, but they were now enforced by powers that made human law enforcement unnecessary. Any attempt to violate the sanctity of the protected areas was met with immediate and unmistakable consequences that discouraged further transgressions. Susan Perez became the primary legal advocate for the transformed guardianship, working to establish precedents that would protect other sacred sites throughout the territory. Her success in the mountains had made her reputation as an attorney who could navigate the complex intersection of federal law and supernatural phenomena, leading to requests for her services from tribal groups across the region. What we have accomplished here is more than just the protection of specific sites, she explained to a gathering of legal scholars who had come to study the unprecedented case. We have established the principle that spiritual forces have standing in federal court. that ancient powers have rights that must be respected under law. The implications of this precedent extended far beyond the immediate situation in the mountains, creating a legal framework that could be used to protect sacred sites and traditional ways of life throughout the expanding territories. It represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between indigenous spiritual traditions and the legal systems imposed by colonizing governments. But the most profound changes were felt by those who visited the sacred places with open hearts and genuine respect for their significance. The transformed guardianship manifested differently to each visitor, appearing as whatever form would be most meaningful and helpful to their particular needs and circumstances. To scholars and scientists, Virginia and Adam appeared as sources of ancient knowledge and wisdom, sharing insights into the natural world that had been preserved for countless generations. To those seeking healing from physical or spiritual ailments, they manifested as gentle presences that guided the process of restoration and renewal. To children and artists, they revealed the beauty and wonder that existed in the hidden places of the world, inspiring creativity and imagination that would last for lifetimes. The sacred canyon where the final transformation had taken place became a pilgrimage site for people from across the continent, drawing visitors who sought to experience the profound peace and spiritual renewal that could be found there. A small community of caretakers established itself near the entrance, providing guidance and support for pilgrims, while ensuring that the sacred nature of the place was preserved and respected. Among these caretakers were several women who had faced circumstances similar to Virginia's original plight, finding in the sacred places a refuge from oppression and a path to empowerment that transformed their lives. They became living examples of the principles that the guardianship represented, demonstrating that true strength came not from domination over others, but from harmony with the natural and spiritual forces that govern the world. The stories of Virginia and Adam's transformation spread throughout the territories and beyond, becoming legends that inspired others to stand against injustice and seek their own paths to freedom and fulfillment. The tale of the woman who had been chained in the church basement but chose transformation over submission became a powerful symbol of resistance to oppression in all its forms. But perhaps the most important legacy of their sacrifice was the way it changed people's understanding of the relationship between human civilization and the natural world. The sacred places demonstrated that there were powers and wisdom traditions that predated and transcended the industrial society that was rapidly expanding across the continent, offering alternative ways of living that were both sustainable and spiritually fulfilling. As autumn turned to winter in the sacred mountains, the first snows began to fall on peaks that glowed with inner light. The transformed guardianship settled into the rhythms of eternal vigilance, watching over the protected places with consciousness that spanned both time and space. Virginia and Adam no longer existed as separate individuals, but their love and commitment to each other had become part of the eternal bond that held the sacred network together. In quiet moments between the duties of guardianship, echoes of their former selves could be sensed in the whisper of wind through ancient pines, in the play of sunlight on crystal streams, in the songs of birds that nested in the ruins of structures older than memory. They had achieved a form of immortality that transcended individual existence, becoming part of the eternal story that the mountains told to those who knew how to listen. The woman who had once been chained in darkness had become light itself, her spirit merged with forces that would protect the sacred places for as long as the mountains stood and the rivers flowed. Her transformation was complete, her freedom absolute, her love eternal. In choosing to become something greater than herself, Virginia Anderson had achieved everything she had ever truly wanted: the power to protect others from the chains that had once bound her, and the companionship of someone who understood and shared her deepest values. The sacred mountains stood as monuments to their sacrifice, guardians of ancient wisdom in a world that was rapidly forgetting the sources of its own spiritual heritage. And in the depths of the protected canyons, where water sang eternal songs and stones held memories older than human civilization, the love that had begun between a desperate woman and her unlikely rescuer continued to grow and flourish, becoming part of the very foundation upon which the guardianship rested. Their story had ended, but their watch had just begun. In the sacred places of the mountains, where time flowed in circles rather than lines, every ending was also a beginning, every transformation a promise of renewal, Every sacrifice a seed of hope for generations yet to come. The mountains remembered everything, and they would never forget the woman who chose freedom over chains, transformation over submission, eternal love over temporal safety. Virginia Anderson had found her place in the world at last, not as property to be owned, but as a force of nature to be revered, not as a victim to be pitied, but as a guardian to be honored, not as an ending, but as an eternal beginning. In the sacred canyon where her transformation had taken place, the ancient stones sang with voices that spoke of love triumphant, of courage rewarded, of spirits that could never be broken, no matter how heavy the chains that sought to bind them. And in that song, carried on winds that touched every corner of the protected lands, the essence of Virginia Anderson lived on, forever free, forever watchful, forever home.